गुड आफ्टरनून एंड अ वेरी वार्म वेलकम टू द ब्लैक होल। 20वीं सदी के अवाइल में यूजेनिक्स के आइडिया ने काफ़ी पॉपुलैरिटी पकड़ी। हालांकि वो बाद में डिबंक हो गया आइडिया, लेकिन उसने अपने पीछे कई अहम सवालात छोड़े जो आज भी जवाब तलब है। मिसाल के तौर पे, इज़ देयर अ जेनेटिक लिंक टू ट्रेड्स लाइक इंटेलेक्ट एंड लाइफ स्पैन, या इज़ इट फेयर टू कैटेगराइज पीपल बेस्ड ऑन समथिंग एज आर्बिट्ररी एज स्किन कलर, या ये कि इफ़ एनिमल्स कुड बी ब्रेड फॉर सर्टन ट्रेड्स, तो क्या इंसानों को भी आप कस्टमाइज़ कर सकते हैं वाया जेनेटिक इंजीनियरिंग। तो ये कुछ बहुत अहम कदरे मुतनाज़ा सवालात हैं, लेकिन टुडे वी विल ट्राई टू डू अ सिंसियर अटैम्प्ट टू लर्न अबाउट दैम। फॉर इट वी आर वेरी ग्रेटफुल टू आवर स्पीकर। मेरे दाएं जानिब मौजूद हैं मोईज़ अहमद ख़ान। इस सीरीज़ में इनका तीसरा लेक्चर है ये, एंड आई होप कि चौथा और पांचवा भी आप कंसीडर कीजिएगा। मोईज़ अहमद ख़ान इज़ अ सिंथेटिक बायोलॉजिस्ट फ्रॉम इंपीरियल कॉलेज लंदन। आपकी रिसर्च जो है वो फोकस करती है ऑन कंस्ट्रक्टिंग सुपर स्प्रेडिंग जीन्स दैट कैन बी यूज्ड फॉर मलेरिया इरेडिकेशन। हिज वर्क इन्वॉल्व्स सिंथेटिक बायोलॉजी, जेनेटिक इंजीनियरिंग, क्लासिकल जेनेटिक्स, डेवलपमेंटल बायोलॉजी एंड एंटोमोलॉजी। आपकी बैचलर्स है इन मॉलिकुलर जेनेटिक्स फ्रॉम किंग्स कॉलेज लंदन एंड मास्टर्स इन सिंथेटिक बायोलॉजी फ्रॉम यूनिवर्सिटी कॉलेज लंदन, एंड यू आर ड्यू टू ग्रेजुएट विद अ PhD फ्रॉम द रॉयल वेटनरी कॉलेज। आप सब लोगों की आमद का शुक्रिया। हमेशा की तरह एक ही बात कि आप अपने सेल फोन्स अगर साइलेंट कर दें तो कोई डिस्ट्रैक्शन नहीं होगी, सीखने का अमल जो है ज़्यादा स्मूथ हो जाएगा। प्रेजेंटेशन और गुफ्तगू के बाद व्हेन द हाउस इज़ ओपन फॉर Q&A, आप भी इसमें ज़रूर शरीक होइएगा। प्लीज़ रेज योर हैंड फर्स्ट, और माइक्रोफोन अपने पास आने के बाद आप बोलिएगा। नाउ प्लीज़ वेलकम मोईज़ अहमद ख़ान। थैंक यू।
Okay, so why am I interested in genetics, eugenics, race? Why should you guys be interested in it? रेस क्या है? रेस को हम नस्ल भी कहते हैं आम फहम ज़बान में। ज़्यादातर ये हमारे जो खाल का रंग है उसके साथ रिलेटेड है, राइट? सो इफ़ यू आर डार्कर इन स्किन टोन and you're particularly dark, people will term you as Africans or African American if you're based in the US. South Asians, as we perceive, have a more brown skin tone, slightly darker. And then Caucasians हैं जो ज़्यादातर European descent के। बहुत वक्त से we have categorized humans into these arbitrary sets based on skin tone alone. और उसका बहुत बड़ा असर हुआ है हमारी सोसाइटी के ऊपर, राइट? वन ऑफ दोज थिंग्स इज़ colonialism. Most of the colonial project was also associated with the idea कि जो गोरे लोग हैं वो ज़्यादा बेहतर हैं किसी तरह से. There was white supremacy, and so they have to bring culture to these other underdeveloped nations like Africa, like South Asia. तो एक तो ये एस्पेक्ट है. फिर दूसरा एस्पेक्ट है कि पाकिस्तान में और इंडिया में अभी तक कास्ट की बात है. कास्ट इज़ एन इम्पॉर्टेंट थिंग टू अस, एंड दैट इज़ ऑल्सो पार्टली जेनेटिक और पार्टली something that we associate with heredity, with ancestry, right? You have the Hazara, which are killed in Balochistan primarily because of their ethnicity. So these are important questions. इन्होंने हमारी हिस्ट्री पे असर डाला है और हमारे ways of thinking पे असर डाला है. सवाल ये बनता है कि रेस जिसको हम परसीव करते हैं सिर्फ स्किन टोन के बेसिस पे, क्या वो साइंसी तौर पे क्या वो असल चीज़ है कि नहीं है? वी हैव द सोशल आइडिया ऑफ रेस, बट इज़ इट साइंटिफिकली एक्यूरेट? इज़ देयर एनी साइंटिफिक बेसिस टू सपोर्ट दिस सोशल आइडिया? तो बुनियादी सवाल ये जो मैं परस्यू करना चाह रहा हूँ. मुझे क्यों इंटरेस्ट है रेस के अंदर अपार्ट फ्राम द हिस्ट्री एंड द पॉलिटिक्स एसोसिएटेड विद इट इज़ बिकॉज आई रियली केयर अबाउट बायोलॉजी. I really like Charles Darwin. I think the man is great. He had some really cool ideas. But the more I learned about eugenics, which I'll talk about what that is, the more I learned about race, I also learned that the people I call my heroes in biology, and really the foundations of biology, have been built by old white men, which had some rather racist views. I'll talk about their views in this lecture. या आपके ऊपर है आप उनको किस तरह जज करना चाहते हैं. डू यू वांट टू जज देम ऑन द बेसिस ऑफ देयर टाइम? उनके ज़माने में क्या बातें हो रही थी, क्या आइडियाज़ थे, तो क्या आर दे जस्टिफाइड इन हैविंग रेसिस्ट व्यूज़? और डू यू वांट टू जज देम बाय योर टाइम? आई लीव दैट अप टू यू. It's not up to me to decide कि आप इसको किस तरह परसीव करेंगे. Okay, so race, genetics and eugenics. One other reason I'm interested in race, specifically in giving this lecture, is because this is Hassan Nisar. Show of hands who recognizes Hassan Nisar, by the way. Okay, so he is a tajziyakar, right? He is a journalist of sorts. And this is him giving a talk. He's done this several times, where he says कि मैंने अपनी genetic ancestry check करवाई है through a company. पता लगे कि मैं South of Central Asia से हूँ, right? Which I think is just South Asia, but like maybe at the border of South Central Asia and Asia. And then he goes on to say कि I am not South Asian, I am different. South Asian खून गलीज है, and the implication being कि हमारे politicians में खून है और हमारे मसले यहाँ से आते हैं. Okay, so what I'm telling you is कि these ideas are still prominent today. This is media पे जानी मानी शख्सियत है जो ये फैला रही है बातें. And they have implications क्योंकि हमारा hypothesis अब क्या बन रहा है कि नहीं यार हमारी नस्ल ही ख़राब है. And this is why the politicians, and this is why we are backwards. So I'll play this video, if I can.
अपना DNA चेक कराया है. अल्लाह का करोड़ करोड़ शुक्र है कि I don't belong to this place. मेरा DNA जो है वो बताता है कि सेंट्रल एशिया के साउथ से ताल्लुक है. हमारा मसला है DNA. 25 करोड़ आबादी हमारी, प्लस माइनस इतना इंडिया, इतना बांग्लादेश, थोड़ा हमसे कम है. ये कहां से आए हैं? और उस गलीज तरीन DNA का आगे जो बॉटम लाइन है वो हमारा सियासतदान. बस DNA is the answer.
आपने सही सुना.
Okay. Yes. And I wish I could talk about things with a passion जिसके साथ ये झूठ बोलते हैं. अगर मैं scientific fact में इतना passion डाल सकूं तो I think I'd be a lot more convincing. I was very angry when I saw this video until I realized this is a great opportunity, guys. We can talk. I can use this video to talk about eugenics, race, genetics, and why Hassan Nisar is wrong. So what we're going to start with is I will talk to you about the history of race, and then I'll talk to you about the science of race. And then hopefully, if we have the time in the end, हम इस वीडियो के पास दोबारा आ सकते हैं और हम ये presume कर सकते हैं अगर हम हसन निसार साहब से बात कर रहे होते तो हम उन्हें कैसे बताते कि क्यों वो गलत है. By the way, I messaged him on Instagram and Twitter, and I was very formal and professional. And I said, "Okay, you have these claims. Can you tell me what company you went to? Can you share your data, please? And would you be open to a discussion about whether or not you're right or wrong?" He didn't respond. He saw it, but he did not respond. But my point is, I'm not just putting him out there. I don't think Hassan Nisar is someone I'm really going after. I just think this is an idea which should be discussed academically. Okay. So. Right. This is a lot of words. हम लोगों ने, इंसानों ने, for a very long time, we have tried to divide ourselves. So Plato in Republic talks about how, there should be stratification of human society. Or they should be arranged such कि जो एक warrior class है, एक academic class है. The philosophers should be the philosophers' kings, which are the smartest, and they should govern. And he also thinks, by the way, the poets shouldn't reproduce क्योंकि जो शायर है उसको पता नहीं क्या मसला है, which, I mean, fair enough, a lot of the poets I know are quite out there, but it's a bit extreme for Plato. So yeah, Plato is very early on. You also have stratification of class in India, right? You have Brahmins, Kshatriya. I had an Indian friend, Hindu friend, once who said कि ये stratifications इतनी permanent नहीं होती थी जितनी अब हो चुकी हैं Hindu class में. But point being, we have been trying to do this for a very long time. मसला क्या आता है कि फॉर द लॉन्गेस्ट टाइम हम जिस तरह रेस को क्लासीफाई कर रहे थे या जिस तरह हम सोसाइटीज़ को क्लासीफाई कर रहे थे उसमें हम साइंस इतनी नहीं डाल रहे थे. हम ओवर आर्चिंगली ये कहते थे कि अच्छा एशिया, लाइक यू आर समवन हु हैज़ ट्रैवल्ड अराउंड द वर्ल्ड, यू वुड से ओके फाइन, आई फाइंड कि लाइक एशिया के लोग जो हैं उनकी येलो स्किन होती है या फिर उनकी आंखें थोड़ी पतली होती हैं, ईस्ट एशिया, एंड देन यू हैव साउथ एशिया विच इज़ ब्राउन, एंड यू हैव अफ्रीका विच इज़ डार्कर स्किन टोन, and then I would associate certain characteristics with that. Okay, so this is one guy who is in the 1700s. He is one of the heroes of biology, by the way. This is Carl Linnaeus. Raise of hands, यहाँ पर किसने वो genus, phylum, family, species वाला classification system पढ़ा है? Okay, yeah. So Homo sapiens is Homo is the genus and sapiens species name, right? That came from Carl Linnaeus. He was the first person to give you taxonomy. जिसकी बेसिस ये थी कि स्पीशीज़ को क्लासीफाई करना चाहिए बेस्ड ऑन देयर कैरेक्टरिस्टिक्स. ओके, how they are related to each other, और फिर वो एक large family और genus और phylum में आती हैं. Linnaeus साहब ने by the way ये भी कोशिश की थी कि वो इंसानों को इस तरह characterize कर सकें. तो this is a man who on the face of it 1700, so maybe you know science as such उस तरह develop नहीं हुई थी formally the way we talk about it, but he's still a logical man. He is saying कि हम 5 species बना सकते हैं, 1 2 3 4 species बना सकते हैं. He added 5 later on by the way, and the 5th species was a monstrous species of sort जो किसी ने आज तक देखी नहीं थी. It was complete fairy tale, but he wanted to add it later on. But खैर, he says Americanus हुए जो आपके Native Americans हैं जिनको Red Indians कहा जाता था, that is incorrect now, but Native Americans. He said they are red, they have straight black and thick hair, gaping nostrils apparently, freckled face, but more importantly they're governed by customary right. Okay, so he's associating mental capacities with them. Europeans हैं, Europeans are white, they're sanguine, they're muscular, they have plenty of yellow hair and blue eyes, and they are light, they are wise, they are inventive, they are governed by rights. And so you have Asiaticus, blackish hair, dark eyes, governed by opinions. Africanus, black, phlegmatic, lazy, sly, sluggish, neglectful, anoints himself with fat, उनको चर्बी अच्छी लगती है अपने ऊपर, और governed by choice and caprice. Okay, so this is Linnaeus talking about this in the 1700s. Why is this important? क्योंकि this string of philosophical inquiry, if you want to call it that, was also later, it made its way into the ideas of people that were contemporaries of Charles Darwin, right? Huxley, for example. And a lot of this, by the way, was also inspired by biblical ideas at the time, religious ideas. Ethnocentrism के जो मैं हूँ, मैं बेहतर हूँ, और जब मैं anthropology करता हूँ, मैं जो किसी और शख्स को देख रहा हूँ, वो बदतर है मेरे से. The issue with this idea is that if you fast forward to the 1900s in the Rwandan genocide, you had the Tutus, the Tutsi, and another race fighting between each other. क्योंकि जो उनके colonizers थे, the Belgians, had classified them partly coming from this angle and this philosophical branch. Rwandan genocide was the first time that you had rape enacted between these tribes on a massive war level scale, and the UN had to intervene. Point being that a lot of our very important times in history are influenced by this guy and people like him and this line of inquiry. This is Charles Darwin. I think he's cool. He had some problems, but he was mostly cool. Charles Darwin was an abolitionist, यानी कि वो कहते थे कि slaves नहीं होने चाहिए. He was also an advocate for women. So for his time, Charles Darwin, okay, 1800s, was mostly a progressive man for Victorian England. Darwin ने हमें overarchingly idea दिया कि natural selection का, कि species will change over time because उनके ऊपर environment acts and provides a certain pressure on them to survive, जिसकी वजह से species जिनका DNA बेहतरीन है survive करने के लिए, they survive, they pass off their genes. Species that are not designed to survive will die off and not pass off their genes, right? So evolution by natural selection, which has a large impact on us, because as we were just discussing before this lecture, DNA, genetics, cancers, oncology would not have existed if we hadn't learned about evolution, or at least not in this way. So Darwin, he has a massive impact on us, on biology, on society. He's one of the heroes of biology. He wrote this book called The Descent of Man, 1871 mein. And in Descent of Man, he says, he's talking about the break between low sort of races and higher races like the whites, essentially the Europeans. And he says that the break will then be rendered wider. ये खला जो है ये ज़्यादा बड़ी हो जाएगी. For it will intervene between man in a more civilized state. वो शख्स जो ज़्यादा civilized है उसके बीच में, as we may hope, then the Caucasian and some ape as low as a baboon instead of as present between a Negro or Australian and the gorilla. He's saying that hopefully as we progress, ये खला जो है between the uncivilized people and the civilized people will extend just the way it does for animals. So he's associating civilization with a certain race, which is a problem. Particularly also because Alfred Russel Wallace, जिन्होंने Darwin के साथ ही evolution की theory publish की थी, was not a racist. At least he didn't have this extreme views. And Darwin himself, one of his tutors was a freed African slave. right? So it's interesting, Darwin trying to cope with ideas of race. He is the one जिसने evolution propose किया है. He is telling you कि इन जानवरों में और पौधों में, मक्खियों में, मच्छरों में individual level पे genetic variation है. And then people ask him, well, what do you think about humans? उनमें variation है कि नहीं है? Is it associated with race? So I'll go in depth about his opinions, unless we have a question.
Yes, a comment actually. He wrote a book called The Expression of Emotions in Man. And for that, he sent emissaries to various parts of the British Empire and asked what would be the facial expression of a man who is angry, of one who is hungry, of one who is frustrated, of one who is happy. And he got, because there were no cameras in those times, he had people make sketches. And 30 different places in the world that he collected pictures from. It's a very famous book of his, The Expression of Emotions in Man and Animals. He comes to the conclusion that there is a human race with common features of expression. And so that actually dilutes some of what you're saying.
Yeah. I'm going to talk about Darwin for racism and against racism, by the way. I don't want you guys to get the impression that he is a complete racist, especially for his time, I think. Even on race, his views are relatively progressive. So I'm going to give you both sides of Darwin, because I want to do him justice. The emotions of man, by the way, this idea that there are universal expressions persisted for a while. I think it was in the late 1900s. They did this research where they went to far-off tribes, वो जिनका ताल्लुक अभी तक नहीं रहा civilization के साथ, and they tried to check कि अच्छा, they showed them pictures of people, कोई गुस्सा कर रहा है, कोई smile कर रहा है, and they asked them कि what do you think this is? And turns out कि वो जो tribe है, जिसने आज तक कभी और इंसान नहीं देखे थे, they accurately predicted कि अगर जो smiling बंदा है वो smile कर रहा है, जो गुस्सा कर रहा है वो गुस्सा कर रहा है. But turns out that if you actually looked into the study, it was like actors, just like very massive smiles and very angry, and there was no nuance in their expression. And also the question wasn't कि आपको क्या लगता है कि ये शख्स क्या कर रहा है, इसकी अंदर feelings क्या हैं. सवाल ये था गुस्से वाली शक्ल दिखाई और फिर सवाल पूछेंगे आपको लगता है ये शख्स गुस्सा कर रहा है, क्या ख्याल है आपका. तो just that idea convolutes it, and later they found that there is no such thing, at least the way Darwin suggested, about emotions and emotional expression. Universal level पे उस तरह शायद नहीं पाई जाती. So yeah, interesting. By the way, feel free to interrupt me in this lecture because I think it's more interesting that way. Darwin, okay. I want to do justice to Darwin because I like him, but also I think he's an interesting character. Darwin for racism मैं आपको पहले बताता हूँ Descent of Man में. Darwin कह रहे कि देखें भाई मैं historian नहीं हूँ, I'm not a politician, I'm a naturalist. Naturalist जब किसी भी जानवर को देखेगा और उसकी वेरिएशंस को देखेगा, यानी कि एक ही स्पीशीज़ है जानवर की मगर उसमें मुख्तलिफ इकसाम नज़र आ रही हैं, मुख्तलिफ एट्रीब्यूट्स नज़र आ रही हैं, तो वो क्या नतीजा अखज़ करने की कोशिश करेगा. First he would notice, if he was a naturalist applying this philosophy to humans, कि races में distinct characteristics तो हैं, morphological features में फ़र्क तो है races के बीच में. People based in Europe, for example, are whiter in skin. People based in Africa, for example, that geographical location are darker in skin. These features are associated with distinct geographical regions. These features are sustained through generations and existed historically. ऐसा नहीं है कि मैं धूप में एक दिन बहुत देर तक बैठा रहा और मैं बहुत स्याह हो गया या फिर मैं जो है इंग्लैंड चला गया तो मैं गोरा हो गया. नहीं. This is historical, this is inherited. यानी कि there is something about our mechanism of inheritance, about us genetically, जिसके ज़रिए ये attributes pass on कर रहे हैं. Though the races can interbreed, the fertility of the progeny is unclear. इसका क्या मतलब है? Darwin primarily ये अख़ज़ करना चाह रहे हैं कि ये जो अलग अलग races हैं, ये अलग अलग species हैं इंसानों की या नहीं. उसकी वजह ये लिनेयस वगैरह जैसे लोग ये दो धड़ों में बटे हुए थे. एक जो कहते थे कि जो 4-5 मुख्तलिफ geographical regions हैं, they are almost different species of humanity, different branches that never coexisted in that same way, no common ancestry. And then there was one side जो कहते थे कि नहीं एक common ancestry थी और फिर बाद में branching off हुई into different races. So he is trying to establish कि अलग अलग रेसेस स्पीशीज़ हैं कि नहीं हैं. अच्छा, जस्ट आउट ऑफ क्यूरियोसिटी एंड यू गाइस कैन स्पीक अप, हाउ वुड यू डिफ़ाइन कि कोई चीज़ स्पीशीज़ है कि नहीं है? हाउ वुड यू से कि एक बकरा जो है वो एक मुर्गी से मुख्तलिफ स्पीशीज़ है या मुख्तलिफ जानवर है? यस, इन द बैक.
इसमें ये होता है अगर तो सेम स्पीशीज़ ब्रीड कर रहा है तो जो उनके ऑफस्प्रिंग्स होंगे वो फर्टाइल होंगे, लेकिन अगर डिफरेंट स्पीशीज़ ने ब्रीडिंग कर ली तो जो उनके ऑफस्प्रिंग्स होंगे फिर वो फर्टाइल नहीं होंगे, वो फर्दर फिर प्रोक्रिएट नहीं कर सकेंगे.
बिल्कुल. सो दैट इज़ द कॉमन डेफिनेशन ऑफ स्पीशीज़. दैट इज़ वन डेफिनेशन दैट नेचुरलिस्ट्स एट द टाइम कह रहे थे कि अच्छा, अगर मुझे कैसे पता आप स्पीशीज़ हो, आप एक डिस्टिंक्ट एंटिटी हो कि आप अपने जैसे जानवरों के साथ रिप्रोड्यूस कर सकते हो, मगर आप किसी और जानवर के साथ रिप्रोड्यूस करो तो आपके बच्चे शायद हो जाएं मगर वो फर्टाइल नहीं होंगे, उन बच्चों के बच्चे नहीं होंगे. बायोलॉजिस्ट ने क्यों ये डेफिनेशन लगाई स्पीशीज़ की? क्योंकि ऑनेस्टली इट्स हार्ड टू डिफाइन स्पीशीज़ गाइज. यू लुक एट द जियोग्राफी ऑफ द वर्ल्ड एंड यू नोटिस कि एक जानवर है, उसका एक किस्म है, बट अगर आप एक मुख्तलिफ एरिया में जाएंगे उसके किसी और किस्म के जानवर से हाइब्रिड्स बन रहे हैं. म्यूल का एग्जांपल अमूमन लोग देते हैं, गधा और घोड़ा अगर मीट करें तो म्यूल बनता है, मगर म्यूल इनफर्टाइल होता है. कुछ जानवर हैं जिनके सिर्फ मेल्स उस तरह के हाइब्रिड्स के फर्टाइल होते हैं, कुछ इनफर्टाइल होते हैं. हार्ड टू डिफाइन स्पीशीज़. बट डार्विन इज सेइंग कि यार देखो, ये जो रेसेस हैं ये तो आपस में इंटरब्रीड कर सकती हैं और फर्टिलिटी तो है, यानी कि उनके भी आगे बच्चे होते हैं. डोंट लुक लाइक स्पीशीज़. बट एट द टाइम इट वाज अनक्लियर कि वो फर्टिलिटी किस हद तक है. It would be unique if a group of mammals displayed such wide variation in skin color, etc., but belonged to the same species. अच्छा, Darwin thought कि mammals जो हमने देखे हैं within the wild, it would be a bit surprising कि उनमें इतना wide difference हो morphological features का, मगर वो एक ही species हो. We know today, by the way, and Darwin's time also he backtracked on it, कि होता है ऐसा. You know, आपको एक ही बंदर की किस्म नहीं, it's the same species but you will have distinct attributes even within the same species of monkey, for example. इसको कहते हैं polymorphism, and this is quite common in the animal kingdom. But Darwin was saying it would still be surprising if you find this in a group of mammals. Lastly, he was saying कि races के जो parasites हैं जो उनको infect करते हैं वो भी मुख्तलिफ हैं, and ये base कर रहा था of anecdotal accounts. Darwin was saying, well, a doctor told me when we were on the ship and then on the Beagle, which is where the ship where he did his voyage, the African slaves were infected with a different kind of lice compared to the Europeans. And this is mostly true, right? When you had mass migrations of Europeans into the New World, which is now America, for example, तो फिर जो नेटिव अमेरिकन्स थे वो उन बीमारियों की वजह से मर गए जो कि यूरोपियंस को जो यूरोपियंस अपने साथ लेकर आए थे. अब यूरोपियंस की उन बीमारियों में इम्यूनिटी थी, नेटिव्स की नहीं थी, बट ऑन द फेस ऑफ इट लुक्स लाइक के रेसेस आर डिस्टिंक्ट इन द वेज दैट दे आर इन्फेक्टेड बाय पैरासाइट्स, द वेज दे आर इन्फेक्टेड बाय डिजीजेस. सो दैट इज़ अनदर थिंग कि अच्छा हाँ, डार्विन ने कहा इन वजूहात की वजह से शायद द डिफरेंट रेसेस आर डिफरेंट स्पीशीज़.
Also lactose intolerance.
Yeah. Lactose intolerance, so my niece, she's 6, she can't digest milk. It's hilarious to watch. But yeah, so pastoral communities जो भैंस और गाय चराते थे, उनमें the ability to digest milk has been retained even after adolescence. But a lot of communities, a lot of populations उसमें lactose intolerant, so they still can't digest it. Okay, Darwin against racism now. He says कि there is plenty of variation within racial groups. Savages, even within the limits of the same tribe, are not nearly so uniform in character as has often been said. Darwin ये कह रहे हैं कि आप एक ट्राइब के अंदर भी चले जाएं, उसमें भी आपको काफ़ी ज़्यादा morphological variation नज़र आएगी. Not all people in South Asia are the same. Not all people in the same tribe have the same skin tone necessarily. And he also adds कि जो हमें वेरिएशन नज़र आती है इंसानियत में वो डिस्क्रीट नहीं है. ऐसा नहीं है कि मैं बस I pop into Europe and everyone is white and I pop into South Asia and everyone is brown. No, it's actually if I am walking along the planet, I will see gradations, I will see a spectrum of morphology, I'll see a spectrum of skin tone, spectrum of eye color. और वो आहिस्ता आहिस्ता एक जो है दूसरे के अंदर ब्लेंड होगा, एक इंसान जो मिलेगा जो शायद थोड़ा कम से हो, एक फिर जो कि थोड़ा यूरोपियन लगता हो, बट ये डिस्क्रीट नहीं है, is what Darwin is saying. And he is also saying and I haven't added this, but he's saying when Darwin is writing, you get an idea कि ये एक spectrum है by the fact that no one so far has been able to agree कि कितनी races हैं, right? At Darwin's time, some people thought there were 3, some thought there were 4, some said it was as big as 62. That is probably a good suggestion कि यार आपसे नहीं हो पाएगा, you know, forget about categorizing these things, it's a spectrum. And there was also this idea कि climate change ने skin को affect किया है इंसानों की, but Darwin is saying कि ये जो climate है ये इतना अच्छा overlap नहीं करता skin tone के साथ. There are issues with that hypothesis. तो okay, my point is Darwin, yes.
So ये बात कितनी सच है कि द डिसेंट ऑफ मैन के जो आइडियाज़ थे उनको इस्तेमाल किया था 1860 से ऑनवर्ड्स जो नाज़ी जो बाद में बने उसी इंटेलिजेंशिया की कुछ फैक्शंस ने, और उसकी वजह से मतलब जूस परसिक्यूशन है वो इवन वर्ल्ड वॉर 1 से उधर से जूस जो थे वो माइग्रेट करना शुरू हो गए थे. तो यानी कि ये कहा जाता है डार्विन के ऊपर ये तनकीद है कि उसके आइडियाज़ जो थे उन्होंने सोशलिस्ट डार्विनियन सोशलिज्म और ये वो यस उसको जन्म दिया, और उसकी वजह से फिर स्पेशली यूरोप में, जर्मनी में स्पेशली ये जो एक मूवमेंट शुरू हुई थी जिसको एक तरह से साइंटिफिक आर्गूमेंट्स मिल गए थे.
I'll come to that. मगर my perception of it is that Darwin is not entirely to blame. There is another person, actually, good point. Now I can go to Francis Galton. Francis Galton was Darwin's cousin. And I would say if anyone is to blame, maybe start with him before you go to Darwin. Galton was an interesting guy. He was 2 years old when he could start reading. And people thought he was going to be this incredible genius. He had a lot of pressure from his family. Very elite circles, by the way. And he was Darwin's cousin, and he initially wanted to be a mathematician of sorts. मगर बाद में he got interested in biology. और उसने सोचा कि यार Darwin has these ideas. How do I associate them with how race operates in humanity, how intelligence varies with humanity? And you know what, if you think about it, अगर मैं Darwin के ज़माने में रह रहा हूँ और मुझे कोई कह रहा है कि यार देखो inheritance is a thing, evolution is a thing, we can breed animals, we can breed crops for certain properties, तो maybe it stands to reason कि okay, अगर मैं इंसानियत के benefit के लिए सोच रहा हूँ तो क्या हम इंसानों को इस तरह ब्रीड कर सकते हैं कि सबसे समझदार, सबसे अक्लमंद, सबसे ताकतवर इंसान, सबसे मॉरल इंसान सोसाइटी में रहें, जो बीमारियों वाले इंसान हैं, जो कि इमोरल हैं, जो कि अक्लमंद नहीं हैं, फीबल माइंडेड कहा जाता था उस ज़माने में, वो ना रहें. आप इसको यूटिलिटेरियन पर्सपेक्टिव से देखें तो समझ आती है, मुझे कम से कम समझ आती है, एंड देयर इज़ नो शेम इन एक्सेप्टिंग दैट. सो फ्रांसिस गाल्टन वाज डूइंग दैट. The only issue is कि गाल्टन की जो साइंस है वो इतनी अच्छी नहीं थी, तो ही पब्लिश दिस बुक. अच्छा, बाय द वे, दिस आइडिया कि इंसानों को इस तरह ब्रीड किया जाना चाहिए ताकि बेहतर से बेहतर इंसान पैदा होते रहें, इट्स कॉल्ड यूजेनिक्स, एंड गाल्टन वाज द फर्स्ट पर्सन टू कॉइन दिस टर्म इन दिस बुक कॉल्ड हेरिडिटरी जीनियस. गाल्टन ने किया क्या, विच इज़ रियली बैड साइंस, बट ही सेड कि लेट्स लुक एट इंटेलिजेंस. कौन सी फैमिलीज़ हैं जो सबसे ज़्यादा इंटेलिजेंट या सबसे ज़्यादा मेरिटोक्रेटिक या वेल नॉन मेरिटोक्रेटिक बट सबसे ज़्यादा इस्टेब्लिश नज़र आती हैं मुझे, राइट, लेट मी गो टू दोज. और फिर मैं देखता हूँ कि उनके बच्चे क्या उतने वेल इस्टेब्लिश थे कि नहीं थे, और उनके जो बच्चों के बच्चे हैं वो उतने वेल इस्टेब्लिश थे कि नहीं थे, उतने इंटेलिजेंट थे कि नहीं थे. द इशू विद दैट इज़ के गाल्टन इज़ नॉट अकाउंटिंग फॉर द फैक्ट कि वो फैमिलीज़, उनके पास एक हेड स्टार्ट था, राइट. अगर मेरे वालिद साहब जो उनके पास बहुत ज़्यादा पैसे हैं बट ऑल्सो रिसोर्सेज है और इंटेलेक्ट भी है जो वो मुझे कल्चरली ट्रांसमिट कर सकते हैं, तो आई एम मोर लाइकली टू बी बेटर इस्टेब्लिश्ड देन से समवन हु इज़ फ्रॉम अ लोअर सोशियो इकोनॉमिक क्लास who just does not have that same starting point. Galton did not consider that primarily. Another thing that Galton did, and I'll come to this later as well, was he did twin studies. So twins are interesting because if you are genetically identical twins, दो तरह के होते हैं, एक जो कि genetically identical होते हैं, they come from the same egg which is divided, और एक जो कि डिफरेंट इंडिपेंडेंट फर्टिलाइजेशंस होती हैं, तो दे नॉट इंटायरली आइडेंटिकल, दे आर सिबलिंग्स, मगर उनका पैदाइश का वक्त एक होता है. जो आइडेंटिकल ट्विन्स हैं उनमें जेनेटिक्स भी सेम है, और अगर वो एक साथ पले हैं तो उनकी इन्वायरमेंट भी सेम है. जो नॉन आइडेंटिकल ट्विन्स हैं उनकी जेनेटिक्स डिफरेंट है बट इन्वायरमेंट सेम है. सो दिस इज़ अ वे फॉर मी टू रूल आउट इन्वायरमेंटल फैक्टर्स जो कि इंटेलिजेंस को इन्फ्लुएंस कर रहे हैं, और टू रूल आउट जेनेटिक फैक्टर्स जो कि इंटेलिजेंस को इन्फ्लुएंस कर रहे हैं. तो ही डिड दैट, बट ही वेंट टू दीज ट्विन्स दैट ही न्यू एंड दीज फैमिलीज जिनके ट्विन्स हुए थे, एंड ही जस्ट आस्क्ड देम कि आपको क्या लगता है कि आपके मुताबिक आप कितने एस्टैब्लिश्ड हैं, एंड वेयर डू यू थिंक इट केम फ्रॉम, यू नो, डिड यू पुट एनी एफर्ट इनटू दिस. सो इट वाज not really scientific research as such, क्योंकि it was quite subjective. You are relying on the interpretation of your own sample. मगर बहरहाल Galton got very popular. He ran around in good circles, and he did some good work. You know, in statistics especially, these were the people जिन्होंने Darwin की theory of evolution को एक primarily words से they put them into math and statistics and probability. They turned it into more of a hard science. And it's not surprising that to this day, UCL, for example, has the Galton laboratory. It has the Galton lecture theatre. और वहाँ पे भी lectures होते हैं. So they had some good influence on biology. Galton also influenced Ronald Fischer. किसी ने कभी, if you're doing O-levels biology, have you done the chi-squared test अभी तक? Okay, so you'll probably do it in A-levels. Chi-squared test is कि मैंने देखना है कि एक जीन जो है वो अगली नस्ल में कितनी तेज़ी किस proportion में फैल रही है, और I can just do a probability distribution, यानी कि मैं कह सकता हूँ कि well 50% is the likelihood, that's my expected value कि 50% of the children will have this gene. बहरहाल Ronald Fischer established the chi-square test, and we still use it today. So great guy in terms of statistics, but he also further proposed these ideas of eugenics. अब हो क्या रहा था इस ज़माने में? This is the late 1800s and early 1900s when Galton and Ronald Fischer are working, कि you had some very different economic and social circumstances. Ideas of people like Thomas Malthus, who said कि well, population is expanding exponentially in the world, मगर resources हमारे limited हैं, तो probably हमारे पास एक crash आने लगा population में. We need to do something about this. That was called Malthusian population control. Malthusian mathematics?
Linear resources grow linearly, population grows exponentially.
Yes.
So Malthusian economics.
Okay. So people were worried about population, and they were thinking कि अगर सबसे अच्छे इंसान ही जिंदा रहें और वही resources utilize करें, तो that's maybe not a bad idea. We need to be doing something about population control. This was also the time जब दुनिया आहिस्ता आहिस्ता थोड़ी progressive हो रही थी, surprisingly, and actually eugenics was a core philosophy at times of even the progressive movement, not just the right-wing parties like Nazism. And it got to a time जहाँ पे really it was famous all around the world. Churchill was a eugenicist, Nazis, but also Latin America, most of the colonized world. We talked last time about the Mary Stopes Society. अगर आप लोग medicine practice करते हैं तो आपने उनका नाम सुना होगा. Mary Stopes was a eugenicist woman who was trying to bring population control to South Asia. Up they do good work, but my point is that they have an interesting history. So yeah, eugenics was a very popular movement, and what it led to was some pretty nasty circumstances, one of which was, yes?
Do we have any example of twins who are both geniuses or extraordinarily intelligent?
That's a good question. मैंने twin studies पढ़ी हैं, जो थोड़ी population level पे होते हैं. They're not looking at a single twin couple. I don't know about twins that are independently, यानी एक individual sample which is a genius.
Especially the identical twins.
I don't know. Good question. Yeah. Is it likely? I think probably not, possibly not. But there's also a savant like autism, for example, जो कि ASD, autism spectrum disorder, is a condition जिसमें कि you have some very incredible abilities but only in a very specific field और बाकी चीज़ों में आप struggle कर रहे हैं तो if उसका genetic component है तो maybe twins but I don't know that's the point.
Just to move away from Europe for a little while, ये भी आप जहन में रखें कि सऊदी अरब की उलेमा ये कहते हैं कि हम इंडोनेशिया की उलेमा को जानते ही नहीं, उनको मानते ही नहीं, वो हमारी नस्ल के हैं नहीं। तो हम लोगों में जो नस्ल की बुनियाद पर फ़र्क किया जाता ना, वो यूरोप से कुछ कम नहीं है। सैयदों को देखें, वो अपने आप को किस नस्ल से जोड़ते हैं, आबाओ अजदाद कहते हैं हमारे, तुम्हारे आबाओ अजदाद से बेहतर थे, तो इसीलिए वो अपने आप को जुदा रखते हैं।
Coming to the question of twins, it reminds me of two physicists here, Dr. Riazuddin and Fayazuddin. They were twins. They were both students of Professor Salam, and they both did particle physics, but they weren't of the same intellectual caliber. So it's it's not necessary.
Riazuddin Saab, did he teach at NUST or?
No, he died. He died in 2013.
That's unfortunate.
Fayazuddin is alive.
Okay, nice. Saw a lecture of his at NUST. It's quite interesting. Okay, yes, let's start there.
So do these eugenics ideas, do they come from competition between tribes of humans in the early days and still continues now? Do these come from a desire for people from different tribes to compete against each other? So hence they use eugenics as a means of justifying their actions?
Probably. In reading up for this lecture, I've come across cases जहाँ पे clearly बंदे को पता है कि racial differences as such नहीं है, but उस philosophy को exploit किया जा रहा है for political purpose या to acquire resources. Nazism is a good example क्योंकि it's interesting क्योंकि the Nazi scientists at the time weren't entirely sure. They were divided on whether races में इतना distinct फ़र्क है और ख़ास तौर पे Jews जो हैं वो इतने बदतर हैं जितना Nazism कह रहे हैं कि नहीं है, मगर that didn't stop the Nazi political elite from utilizing that propaganda and exploiting it to gain resources and capital.
यहाँ पे बस मैं फिर वही चीज़ ऐड करना चाहूँगा, डॉक्टर साहब ने जो बात की थी अभी कि जो मुझे लग रहा है कि यूरोसेंट्रिसिज्म बहुत ज़्यादा है। अगर हम अपने इस खित्ते को देखते हैं तो फॉर इंस्टेंस ऋग्वेदा जो है यहाँ पे लिखी गई, तो ऋग्वेदा में बहुत क्लियरली लिखा गया है कि जो दासूज हैं, जो शूद्राज हैं, ये जो हैं स्याह रंग वाले हैं और ये काली चमड़ी वाले हैं और ये जो है हमसे बदतर हैं, और इंद्रदेव जो है वो चूँकि फेयर स्किन्ड हैं और आर्या चूँकि फेयर स्किन्ड हैं तो दे आर कि वो खुदा के जो है ज़्यादा चहीते हैं, बर्मा के ज़्यादा चहीते हैं। इस तरह से जो मुस्लिम ट्रेडिशन में आप इब्न खल्दून को देखें तो बहुत क्लियरली वो हाफ तकलीम का जो कॉन्सेप्ट है कि दुनिया जो है वो 7 उसमें तकसीम है, तो वो कालों के बारे में तो बहुत क्लियर लिखते हैं कि ये तो जानवरों से की करीब की जो है ये नस्ल है और इनको जो है वो ग़ुलामी के उसमें जो है रहना चाहिए। तो फिर हमारी इवन अपनी हिंदुस्तान में जो ट्रेडिशन रही थी अकबर से पहले, जितना भी मुस्लिम यहाँ पे रूलिंग लीड्स हैं वो सारी की सारी जो 100% दरबार था वो तुरानियों पर ईरानियों पर मुश्तमिल होता था, क्योंकि मकामी हिंदुस्तानियों को तो वो इंसान भी नहीं समझते थे। और इवन अकबर के बाद भी जब मुगल यहाँ पे उन्होंने इंटीग्रेशन शुरू की तो 70 to 80% तब भी जो थे वो जो रूलिंग लीड थी, मुस्लिम रूलिंग लीड जो थी, देवर आइदर फ्रॉम ईरान या वो सेंट्रल एशिया से आते थे। और आज भी वो जनरल मुबीन साहब हैं वो तालिबान के अफगानिस्तान के, तो वो अक्सर हर दूसरे दिन जो है वो कहते हैं तौर पंजाबियानों के काले मुंह वाले पंजाबी ना, वो तो बिल्कुल इंतहाई रेसिस्ट किस्म को, यूट्यूब पे आप जाएंगे वो लिखा होगा। तो आई थिंक वो सब कुछ उससे गोरे पे डाल देना, तो आई थिंक वो एक साइड की पिक्चर है। जो अदर कॉइन है वो तो ये कि खुद हमारे अपने ट्रेडिशन के अंदर बहुत कुछ जो है वो रेसिस्ट है, अगर आज के उस पर अगर आप रीड करेंगे उसको तो।
हाँ नहीं, दैट्स अ गुड पॉइंट। तो आई डोंट वांट टू इम्प्लाई कि सिर्फ गोरे जो हैं उन्होंने ये गलती की थी। मैंने ज़्यादा उन पे इसलिए फोकस किया है क्योंकि यूजेनिक्स एज अ पॉलिटिकल फिलोसफी, एज एन आइडियोलॉजी sort of generated in the West, क्योंकि it was verbalized as such। फिर उसकी eugenics policies, क्योंकि गोरों के पास हुकूमत थी via colonialism over most of the world, they are to blame for their actions. But you're right, as an ideology, even though उसको eugenics कहा नहीं जाता था, but variations of this existed elsewhere. Yeah, हाँ, and also it's interesting, isn't it? I wasn't entirely sure before this lecture कि अच्छा this idea of racism क्या ये entirely western concept है या फिर पहले से हमारे पास था। I now believe कि it's just what you don't understand, आपको उससे डर लगता है, that's your initial reaction। बेशक आप गोरे हो या आप काले हो, से अफाम हो या आप साउथ एशियन हो, So I think it's a very human response. And maybe there's an evolutionary reason कि शायद क्योंकि हम ज़्यादातर as hunter gatherers exist करते थे. Maybe we want to, you know, something in our biology says कि यार नहीं मुझे अपने जैसे लोगों के साथ I'm safer क्योंकि maybe evolutionarily those are the people that have been around me, whereas the other is what I'm afraid of. And people that do that are more likely to survive, perhaps. मैं hypothesize कर रहा हूँ, but yes, ये सिर्फ गोरे नहीं है, हम भी हैं, by the way. Okay. This is Jim Watson, ये गोरा है. He discovered the structure of DNA. Big deal, very big deal, right? And he won the Nobel Prize for it. Jim Watson ने देखा है ज़माना. He has seen the civil rights movement. He probably has African American colleagues जो कि इसके जितना ही इतना अच्छा काम कर रहे हैं. But that doesn't stop him from speculating and saying things like he previously advocated for eugenics. Eugenics policies बड़ी interesting थी. उनमें in the 1900s there were policies के लोगों को castrate कर देना चाहिए जो कि feeble-minded हैं, and they were enacted in Nazi Germany, but also in Europe and also in the Americas. So he is saying that maybe we should have some sort of eugenics policies. By the way, Jim Watson is not going that far. He is saying that, like, okay, maybe on a population level, the most intelligent people should be told, that, oh, find another intelligent mate, right? Right, and so he advocated for that. He also said that there is a link between darker skin and higher libido, which has been busted. There is no such link. 7 years later, he went significantly further. He said that black and white people do not share equal powers of reason. उनमें फ़र्क है. And since then, he quoted that Jews are smarter, Brahmin Indians जो हैं वो naturally select किए गए for intelligence, and East Asians जो हैं वो ज़्यादा conform करते हैं society के साथ, and this is also potentially genetic. These are, you know, my issue with this is not that these are racial views. My issue with this is that he does not have the scientific evidence to support any of this. I am fine with Jim Watson speculating on these things and saying that ऐसा हो सकता है, we should look into this, and sure, if you find out, that's interesting. But he's presenting this as scientific fact or belief. My point is that eugenics as a philosophy still exists, maybe not to the extent that it was in the 20th century, but still in certain circles it does. Okay, this is one of the eugenics policies in Nazi Germany. This is basically a poster by Nazi Germany जहाँ पे they're saying कि एक healthy family जिसको कोई genetic condition नहीं है, वो state के ऊपर उतना ही burden है या फिर उतना ही पैसा required है to sustain it compared to a feeble-minded person, which is inbred, which comes from a bad stock. And this is part of the Nazi propaganda which they utilized against the Jews. And they were talking about castration, they were talking about promoting fertility amongst the healthiest, amongst the most intellectual. Bans on immigration and movement were important because I don't want bad blood coming into my borders, leave that out. And genocide, right, in Nazi Germany was also a eugenics policy partly. Okay, now this is the history, yes.
अस्सलामुअलैकुम. अच्छा, हमने यूजेनिक्स पॉलिसीज़ जो देखी हैं, जो पॉलिटिक्स में आई हैं, अभी तक हमने वो देखी हैं जो नेगेटिव हैं. पॉजिटिव कोई आई हैं या नहीं? क्योंकि एक बुक है बेल कर्व के नाम से जो कि बहुत कंट्रोवर्शियल है और इट्स अबाउट मेकिंग एजुकेशनल पॉलिसीज़ दैट फेवर पीपल ऑफ ऑल रेसेस इक्विवेलेंटली, बट इट इज़ कंसिडर्ड वेरी controversial even in academic circles, which is a problem.
Yeah, a lot of the points in the bell curve have been busted since then, or at least in academic tanqeed काफ़ी हुई है, but it's unfortunate that they haven't gained as much popularity. There's a really good book that I'd suggest you guys read. It's called Skin Deep by Gavin Evans, and he has an entire chapter dedicated to the bell curve and some of its basic assumptions. Eugenics policies, by the way, मैं ये नहीं कहूँगा पूरी तरह बुरी नहीं थी. That's a good point. A lot of these guys that were eugenicists, they were thinking about the betterment of society. And so things like intelligent people should marry amongst themselves. They were thinking about the betterment of society, and the government was giving out bonds and schemes to promote that. Ronald Fischer, for example, I do believe, वो racist आदमी नहीं था. There's a difference between being a racist and being a eugenicist. Race is the association of these factors like intelligence with a particular skin color, with a particular geographical location. Eugenics is just the idea that the most intelligent people, the smartest people, the best people should intermarry and produce the best stock. Yes,
At some point, has there been a divergence of association of race with color, though? Because, for example, in Americas, when the initial mass migrations happened, a lot of discrimination was towards races such as the Irish or the Italians. Similarly, यहाँ जो हमारी historical divides in things like Punjabi classes, जिस तरह अराई हो गए, जट हो गए, इस तरह हो गए, where maybe someone considers another person lesser and wouldn't want to have marriages with them, etc. Like, has race always been, especially over the past 100 years, directly linked to color predominantly?
Not always, because I don't know if it was South African apartheid or if it was also the United States, where there was the idea of one drop of blood, right? So if you have one drop of African blood, then you are African in descent. And then you are categorized in apartheid South Africa as that category, which is not good for you. Even if you appear, for example, as white or Caucasian. So it hasn't always been associated with color, but largely it has. And the reason I'm focusing on color is also because some of the science I'm going to discuss, those were the criteria they used to divide races, the samples that were coming from different races. ये आप लोगों पे मैं सवाल छोड़ देता हूँ कि आपको लगता है कि कास्ट रेस से मुख्तलिफ चीज़ है कि नहीं है, और हुड भाई साहब ने जैसे सईदों की बात की थी, तो if the genetics suggests कि एक link है with you and then an Arab tribe at the time of the Prophet, go and get your DNA sequenced. I think that would be very interesting. And then live with the consequences, right, if you don't find any answers. But yeah, caste or race is a good question. I don't have the answer to it.
I have a comment. Daniel Dennett जो है वो जो cognitive I think scientist है, उसने एक किताब लिखी 1995 में डार्विन्स डेंजरस आइडियाज़ के नाम से.
Okay.
तो उसमें उसने हॉब्स का भी जिक्र किया और फ्रीडरिक नीचा का भी जिक्र किया. तो इनके आइडियाज़ भी सोशल इंजीनियरिंग के हिसाब से यूज़ हुए हैं आई थिंक, नाज़ी जर्मनी में भी और इस हवाले से भी. तो क्वेश्चन यही है कि फिर ये मोरालिटी पे आ जाते हैं हम बेसिकली, कि मोरालिटी की क्या बेसिस है और क्या जेनेटिकल उसकी क्या बेसिस हो सकती हैं, और ऑफ कोर्स वो रिचर्ड डॉकिंस का जो आइडिया है सेल्फिश जीन्स का, उसको इसके साथ कैसे लिंक किया जा सकता है.
बहुत ही गहरा सवाल आपने पूछा. मोरालिटी की क्या जेनेटिक बेसिस है? आई हैव अ स्लाइड ऑन दैट, so I won't talk about that right now. Selfish gene. Dawkins has, I don't know where I stand on Dawkins, because he has at some points made remarks that are racist, and some points he hasn't. I don't think he's a racist individual. I just think he's a politically incorrect individual. His idea of the selfish gene, how that associates with race, I'd have to think about that. I can't give you an answer immediately. I do think I agree with his premise. Some people don't, but I agree that genes are the fundamental unit जिस पे evolution काम करती है, and they can act selfishly, sometimes not in the interest of the organism either. Race का क्या उससे ताल्लुक है? I don't know. Okay, is there a genetic basis for race? So now I'll talk to you about the science of race, and hopefully when you guys talk to people that are racist or differ with you on opinions on race, आप ये science bring up कर सकते हैं. आपने उसको इस्तेमाल किस तरह करना है आपकी मर्ज़ी है, मैं आपको सिर्फ फैक्ट देने की कोशिश करूँगा. I can give you my opinion as well. We have the ability finally to be able to sequence DNA. हम आपका एक सैम्पल ले सकते हैं, थूक का सैम्पल ज़्यादा लिया जाता है कंपनीज लाइक 23andMe, और there's a technology called next generation sequencing, जिसके ज़रिए आपका सारा जीनोम, if we wanted, all the DNA in your cell वो सीक्वेंस किया जा सकता है, और मैं देख सकता हूँ कि उसमें कौन सी जीन्स कहाँ पर हैं, आपके पास कौन सी जीन का कौन सा वेरिएंट है. एक इंटरेस्टिंग चीज़ जो आपके जीनोम के अंदर है इज़ कॉल्ड माइक्रोसैटेलाइट्स. माइक्रोसैटेलाइट्स आर जस्ट अ DNA सीक्वेंस जो एज सच कोई जीन नहीं पैदा कर रहा, बट वो बार बार रिपीट होता है एक ही ख़ास पैटर्न में, और ये एक म्यूटेशन है जो कि अकर करती है ड्यूरिंग एवोल्यूशन. माइक्रोसैटेलाइट्स बाय द वे नॉर्मल म्यूटेशन से ज़्यादा तेज़ी से बनती हैं ह्यूमन पॉपुलेशंस के अंदर. इसका मतलब ये है कि ऐसा हो सकता है कि वी नो नाउ बाय द वे थ्रू दिस टेक्नोलॉजी के ह्यूमंस माइग्रेटेड आउट ऑफ अफ्रीका. सो नॉट जस्ट होमो सेपियंस बट होमो इरेक्टस एंड देयर प्रायर फॉर्म्स इवॉल्व्ड primarily in Africa and then migrated. But because of microsatellites, what I can do is I can go like, well, hypothetically, Homo sapiens की group थी जो अफ्रीका में थी, They migrated over long amounts of time, large amounts of time, tens of hundreds of thousands of years, to other continents. And as they migrated, उनके DNA में mutations आई होंगी, और ये satellites की mutations मैं track कर सकता हूँ. अगर अफ्रीका से लोग आए तो फिर अफ्रीका की माइक्रो सैटेलाइट्स जो हैं उनकी बड़ी एंसेस्ट्रल म्यूटेशंस होंगी, और फिर जो बाकी लोग हमें और जोग्राफिकल रीजन्स में नज़र आएंगे उन्होंने वो म्यूटेशंस इनहेरिट की होंगी, बट उसके साथ साथ नई म्यूटेशंस भी स्प्रिंग अप की होंगी उनके साथ. दिस इज़ वन वे फॉर मी टू बिल्ड अ मैप ऑफ ह्यूमन माइग्रेशन. अगर मैंने पता करना है कि इंसान आया कहाँ से, कदीम इंसान, उसके खदोखाल क्या थे, बट ऑल्सो वो कहाँ से कहाँ तक गया, किन लोगों के साथ उसने मेट किया, आई कैन डू दैट यूजिंग नेक्स्ट जनरेशन सीक्वेंसिंग. दैट्स वन थिंग. ये टेक्नोलॉजी सिर्फ इंडिपेंडेंटली काम नहीं करती, आपको फॉसिल एविडेंस भी चाहिए होता है, हिस्टोरिकल एविडेंस भी चाहिए होता है. एंड सो वी हैव कंबाइंड ऑल ऑफ दीज, एंड व्हाट वी गेट इज़ अ मैप ऑफ ह्यूमन माइग्रेशन which tells us कि we migrated out of Africa, not just a single group, but this happened multiple times. History में कई दफ़ा इंसान आता था, अफ्रीका से बाहर निकलता था, फिर वापस जाता था, फिर और आगे पहुंचता था. Polynesians, even before the British, before we had big boats, had figured out how to build canoes to go between continents, which is quite interesting. तो इंसान जो है वो coastal areas तक भी पहुंच गया था through migration. Yes.
So this says Homo sapiens arrived 300,000 to 500,000 years ago. There it says 150,000 years ago.
Fair enough, actually. I would say go with 300,000, 500,000, not 150,000. This probably isn't talking about Homo sapiens. This is talking about modern humans, which.
And that statement at the top that says like Homo sapiens and most Europeans today can trace their ancestry that appeared between just 50,000 to 13,000 years ago. That seems like a short time.
It's based on mitochondrial DNA evidence. That's not the only form of evidence we used. This paper is from the early 2000s. So maybe it's been updated since then. But fair enough, good catch. So what we know is that humans migrated out of Africa. And what that means is that really, if you're talking about race, at least consider the fact that despite what race you are, you all have the same common ancestry. So kahin na kahin aapka genetic link to hai with the race you probably hate. There was also this idea, by the way, during the times of Darwin and then later on, that the skull size was a good determinant of intellect. कि आपकी खोपड़ी जितनी बड़ी है उसके साथ association है आपकी intelligence की. और if I go further, I can probably show this. Okay. Keep that point in mind because I'll come back to that. अच्छा, that is our ideas of migration. 2002 में एक research हुई थी जहाँ पे we had this massive sample of cells from different populations. It was around 50 different populations और उनके cells को हमने genetically sequence किया था. If you can sequence these populations, तो you can ask the question. मुझे पता है कि ये sample एक South Asian बंदे का है, sample B जो है वो European बंदे का है. अगर मैं फ़िलहाल ये बात भूल जाऊँ और सिर्फ अपने सारे सैम्पल्स का DNA सीक्वेंस करूँ, तो फिर क्या जो जेनेटिक इन्फॉर्मेशन है वो इस तरह क्लस्टर होती है कि वो सैम्पल्स के साथ एग्री करे, उन कैटेगरीज ऑफ साउथ एशिया, यूरोप वगैरह के साथ एग्री करे. So this is what this team did, and the immediate thing they found was कि 95% of the genetic variation, यानी कि वो differences जो genetic हैं एक इंसान के दूसरे इंसान के साथ, 95% of that occurs within populations, यानी कि within races. Point being कि जो हमारा race का idea है वो really सिर्फ 5% of the genetic variation के बारे में बात कर रहा है. If you want.
Can you read this? What are the K's?
Yeah.
And what's written at the top? What's written at the bottom?
So I'll come to this. So K is the number of. Okay, so I put my DNA sequence into this software, and I tell the software that based on the differences in all of my DNA sequence, आप clusters बनाएं. And each color is a different cluster. K is the number of clusters I'm telling my software to make. The software was called Structure. I don't understand the code behind it, but the way it works is that if I ask my software to make 2 clusters of that genetic sequence, तो फिर व्हाट आई फाइंड इज़ कि एक क्लस्टर बनता है उन लोगों का जो कि अफ्रीका, यूरोप, मिडल ईस्ट, सेंट्रल साउथ एशिया में है, और एक क्लस्टर बनता है विच इज़ द पर्पल क्लस्टर ऑफ पीपल इन ईस्ट एशिया. Okay, so if you were a racist, you would be like, aha, I got you. बन रहा है कुछ, there are differences between races. What you would fail to recognize is that this clustering is also showing you a gradation. It's not showing you a distinction between the races. It's showing you that really there is a gradient between them. But also more importantly, this cluster is only using the 5% of DNA जो कि races के बीच में मुख्तलिफ है. The large overarching amount of DNA, which is 95. Other people have suggested like more closer to 98% is similar. The cluster is only, the software is only considering the very small amount of DNA जो इसका फ़र्क है. I can also ask my cluster to go to 3 clusters, my software to do 3 clusters, and then what I'll find is that, oh, by the way, each line on this graph is a single individual. And all of this data represents all the data points जो कि मेरे sample के अंदर थे, सारे samples के अंदर थे. So if I go to 3 clusters, what I find is कि अफ्रीका के लोग, यूरोप के लोग, मिडल ईस्ट के लोग एक क्लस्टर है, अफ्रीका के लोग मुख्तलिफ क्लस्टर हैं, ईस्ट एशिया के लोग एक मुख्तलिफ क्लस्टर हैं. एंड आई कैन कीप डूइंग दिस एंड व्हाट यू विल फाइंड इज़ और अच्छा दीज डेटा बाय द वे 2002 में ये रिसर्च आई थी. इट वाज क्वाइट पॉपुलर. इट हैज़ बीन अपहेल्ड सिंस देन यूजिंग नेक्स्ट जनरेशन सीक्वेंसिंग. एंड व्हाट यू विल फाइंड इज़ आई कैन कीप डूइंग दिस क्लस्टरिंग. और मोटा मोटा ओवरआर्चिंगली इंसान जो हैं वो ख़ास जोग्राफिकल एरियाज़ के अंदर फैलते हैं बेस्ड ऑन द 5% ऑफ DNA जो उनके अंदर वेरी करता है. मगर द इम्पॉर्टेंट पॉइंट इज़ कि अगर मैं 6 क्लस्टर्स बनाने के लिए कहूँ तो फिर यू हैव, बाय द वे दिस इज़ द सब पॉपुलेशंस, तो बंटू एंड देन यू हैव पिग्मीज़ विच बिलोंग टू अफ्रीका. बट खैर इफ़ आई डू 6 क्लस्टर्स व्हाट आई फाइंड इज़ कि अफ्रीका के लोग मुख्तलिफ हैं उस 5% DNA में, यूरोप और मिडल ईस्ट के मुख्तलिफ हैं, सेंट्रल साउथ एशिया के मुख्तलिफ हैं, ईस्ट एशिया के मुख्तलिफ हैं, मगर एक छठा क्लस्टर मुझे मिल रहा है जो कि कम्प्लीटली मुख्तलिफ है बाकी सब से. एंड दिस इज़ द कैलाश इन द हिंदू कुश इन नॉर्दर्न पाकिस्तान. नाउ मोस्ट पीपल, इवन द मोस्ट आर्डेंट रेसिस्ट, वुडंट से कि कैलाश जो हैं एज सच आर ए डिफरेंट रेस in the same way that Africans would be considered a different race to them, or Europeans would be considered a different race. But you can keep clustering the world populations and you will find that once you go beyond k is equal to 6, you end up with clusters जो कि races को नहीं associate कर रहे. What really the clusters are telling you is human history, where humans, because of geographical isolation, because of inbreeding, they had certain microsatellites in them जो उन्होंने preserve की and other humans didn't. ये जो information है by the way has been used by both racists and by both anti-racists because it's confusing, right? On the one hand it's telling you कि overarchingly सब races same हैं, मगर अगर मैं चाहूँ तो मैं microsatellites का इस्तेमाल करके आपको एक clusters बना सकता हूँ. The scientists that did this research have said that this doesn't account for races. These clusters aren't necessarily races. They are accounting for the migration patterns of humans जो कि historically रह चुके हैं. Overarchingly, their data suggests that there is no such thing as race, at least genetically, especially when you consider that most of the variation between the world is not accounted for by race. Okay, so race does not explain human genetic diversity. ये मैं आपको बात बता चुका हूँ. Based on that idea, I will briefly talk about the science of skin color. I don't have any data here, but only recently, I was reading this yesterday, have we actually started to think about looking at the genetics behind skin color. And it's more than just making more melanin or less melanin. What we're finding is कि अफ्रीका के अंदर, सिर्फ अफ्रीका के अंदर, the genes that are responsible for skin color are more varied than the rest of the world, which is interesting क्योंकि I think a normal person would say कि अफ्रीकी सब शायद एक रंग के हैं या हैं तो फिर slight variations हैं, but we are finding कि there is more than one gene for skin color. It's still an ongoing avenue of research. It's what we call a polygenetic factor, यानी कि there's different multiple hundreds of genes potentially जो skin color ज़्यादा dark कर रही हैं, ज़्यादा कम कर रही हैं, and they all contribute in different ways. Okay, that was genetics. By the way, I haven't talked about this, but also the same paper clustered Hazara into the same cluster as Uyghurs in China, which again is interesting. So slight caveat. But I also want to talk about historical evidence, fossil evidence. A lot of the people that are proponents of white supremacy या scientific racism जिसको कहा जाता है, वो कहते हैं कि हमें आर्ट सबसे पहले नज़र आती है यूरोप के अंदर फॉसिल एविडेंस में. उसके अलावा सब लोगों ने who here has read Sapiens by Yuval Noah Harari? Okay, cool. Who here liked it? If you can raise your hand. Okay, nice. One big criticism of Harari has been that he suggested that the way human minds evolved was that they migrated out of Africa into Europe. As they were doing that migration, तो फिर either as a consequence of better nutrition, as a consequence of using fire more regularly, या just as a freak genetic mutation, their minds expanded in terms of just sheer mass. और इसका ये मतलब हुआ कि Europeans as Africans as they migrated out and went into Europe, they evolved better intellectual capacities, जिसकी वजह से the first fossil evidence of art was in Europe, the first fossil evidence of symbolism was in Europe. All of this has been contradicted now. We know that culture, symbolism, tools, art and art were found in African fossils that predate European art. We also know that Homo erectus, जो कि sapiens भी नहीं थे, modern humans भी नहीं थे, were using fire regularly. And the association between intellectual capacity and brain size अब वो murky हो चुकी है. We don't think that it was just sheer brain size that is associated with intellectual capacity. This is work done in mice जहाँ पे larger brains don't necessarily equate better problem solving skills. But this idea still remained क्योंकि it's a catchy idea, you know, कि एक linear story है कि इंसान कहाँ से निकला, जब वो यूरोप में आया तो उसने क्यों आर्ट पैदा की, enlightenment era आया यूरोप के अंदर. Yes.
Doesn't that contradict itself? Because not everyone from Africa is migrating to Europe. Hence, the people who stay in Africa are still using fire. So they would also evolve just as much as the European migration people would.
What's your point?
My point is when Yuval Noah Harari says that people when they migrate to Europe, they start using fire more and hence they developed art. But isn't that also the case for the people living in Africa? Not all of them were migrating in the first place. So they were also using fire more frequently. So they were also developed art. Doesn't the idea contradict itself?
Yeah, so Harari, it's interesting because at the time he was writing Sapiens, we had evidence of earlier African art. But he doesn't include that in his book as such. He talks about the fact that Europe was the earliest incident of art and symbolism especially. Fire का use मैं clarify कर दूँ, what I understand is it was used even prior to Homo sapiens developing. Homo erectus इस्तेमाल कर रहा था आग. Harari ये point कर रहा है कि शायद regular जो आग का है वो उन Homo sapiens ने किया जो अफ्रीका से यूरोप माइग्रेट कर रहे थे, which has since then been disproved based on fossil evidence. मगर आपकी बात शायद सही भी है कि he is contradictory in a way. Also, people like Harari, and by people like Harari I mean people that are supporting that hypothesis, say कि one reason कि Europeans जो हैं या उस ज़माने के जो वो लोग जो अफ्रीका से माइग्रेट करके यूरोप गए उनमें इंटेलेक्चुअल कैपेसिटी काफ़ी ज़्यादा बिल्ड हुई, वुड बी द FOXP2 म्यूटेशन. इस पर काफ़ी काम हुआ था. FOXP2 इज़ अ जीन जो कि उसका एक वेरिएंट बर्ड्स में भी पाया जाता है, ख़ास तौर पे सॉन्ग बर्ड्स, एंड इट्स एसोसिएटेड विद लैंग्वेज एंड वोकेबुलरी. एंड द आइडिया वाज कि FOXP2 इवॉल्व ख़ास सब पॉपुलेशंस में हुई जिनमें बेहतर एबिलिटी फॉर सिम्बलिज्म, बेहतर एबिलिटी फॉर लैंग्वेज एंड आर्ट एंड वोकेबुलरी था. सिंस देन we know कि FOXP2 भी probably अफ्रीका में ही इवॉल्व हो गई थी before the migration events occurred on a large scale, or at least if not early enough, it exists in both African populations and European populations now. So that's okay. So that's racism, science, genetics. One thing I want to talk about is intelligence. Okay. Yes.
So, my question is, when was the intelligence invented? When was intelligence invented actually? Because it relates to power, because you've been using the term intellectual capacity, intelligence. So it would be interesting to know whether this was invented, the idea of intelligence was invented before Darwin or after Darwin.
You mean intelligence as a way of measuring people or saying that ye banda zyada?
Yeah, yeah.
I don't know.
Because skin color it's very easy to judge skin color and the appearance, but it's very hard to judge someone's intelligence.
Yeah.
You judge through instrumental rationality. That's what someone has been able to do with that.
Yeah. So this is a great question.
When was the first IQ test?
Yeah, 1900s, early 1900s. But from what I've read is it's a gradation from Francis Galton doing the early intelligence tests, and then French scientists building on that. So this is one of the early IQ tests by French scientists in the early 1900s, pre-World War I, where the question is कि इन दोनों में से ज़्यादा खूबसूरत कौन है? And you're basing intelligence off of that. Since then, IQ tests have become more standardized. But what I'll show you, by the way, IQ and intelligence measurement was also associated with the eugenics movement. So a lot of the research जो हुई on establishing a way to measure IQ and intelligence was during that era. IQ, as I understand it, is a ratio of your mental age with your actual age. And early intelligence tests जो हैं उनमें they didn't account for things like socioeconomic class, culture, language. Since then it's changed, but even intelligence tests today उनमें loopholes हैं जो मैं आपको बताऊंगा. सबसे पहले तो is intelligence genetic? I will argue that it is largely, it's genetic in the sense that there are genes that account for intelligence, but there is no one gene. It's a polygenic trait, which means so far they think that there's about 200-ish genes, if I'm not wrong, idhar kahin likha hoga, that account for increasing or reducing intelligence as it's measured in IQ tests. We have not been able to find as such a single gene जो intelligence पैदा करती है बढ़ा देती है उसको. The closest we've come to is a set of genes, 538 genes, जो कि शायद 7% switches an IQ test in your favor or against your favor. This was research done at Harvard in the mid-2000s. And they looked at 187 different microsatellites and several genes across the human genome, because अब हमारे पास पूरा genome है इंसानियत का. And they looked at about 200,000 people. And what they said was कि independently हम intelligence genes नहीं नज़र आ रही, but 538 different genes हैं जो आपस में काम करते हैं. This is similar to height, by the way. People say कि is there a single gene for height? There isn't. Biostatisticians are having a lot of fun with it क्योंकि it turns out कि there is one gene जो कि शायद थोड़ा सा आपका height कम कर देगी, but then there's another gene जो ज़्यादा कर देगी, and then there's hundreds of genes that act in concordance with that. And then measuring IQ, जो आपका point था, historically has been problematic, but even today with standardized IQ tests, what we've seen is that women, for example, prior to 2012, were always 10 points behind men in standard IQ tests that are still used today. Post 2012, women have superseded men. जो average खातून की IQ है, it is higher than a man. And what that's showing you is that probably IQ is not a good determinant of genetic intelligence, if there is such a thing. It's really just telling you something. It's influenced by culture, it's influenced by environment. The debate now is also that, well, what we see is that IQ within the world population is increasing compared to the pre-war eras. और उसकी वजह इस वक्त जो एक hypothesis है वो ये कि just people are potentially becoming more scientific because of standardized education or logical, or actually they may just be getting better at doing tests, which is a big component of IQ tests. also there's a big debate on Ashkenazi Jews. Kyunki this is true, Ashkenazi Jews consistently have a higher IQ score. I think it's, I don't know how many points, 7.5 points than the average Caucasian, which is interesting. क्योंकि उसकी बुनियाद पे लोगों ने कहा है कि Ashkenazi Jews खास तौर पे ज़्यादा intelligent हैं, and they are also, I actually double checked when you mentioned this, they are overrepresented in the sciences, and there is a high proportion of Nobel laureates. The research on this, there was a lot of work on this, and the hypothesis that people were making was कि Ashkenazi Jews एक ख़ास bottleneck से गुज़रे अपनी genetic history में, और उस bottleneck का consequence ये हुआ कि एक तो उनका population level reduce हुआ काफ़ी ज़्यादा, जिसका मतलब है कि alleles and genes like Tay-Sachs disease वो उनके अंदर ज़्यादा fix हो सकें. This is a phenomena called genetic drift basically, and the way it happens is कि अगर बहुत छोटी populations हैं जिनमें genetic variation बहुत ज़्यादा नहीं है, उनमें unusual genes ज़्यादा तेज़ी से फैल सकती हैं, and it's just a consequence of the law of large numbers compared to small numbers. तो early on the hypothesis was कि Ashkenazi Jews शुरू में बहुत छोटी population के थे. When they migrated into fields जहाँ पे a lot of money lending was involved and a lot of business acumen was involved, तो फिर they started selecting, the small population started selecting for people that were good at these fields. The idea being कि this population जो कि अच्छी थी इन कामों में, जो intellectual थी, ended up surviving and doing better than the Ashkenazi Jews जो कि नहीं कर रहे थे इतना अच्छा काम. तो फिर what you have over here is natural selection एक किस्म की, artificial breeding, जिसमें कि the Jewish population, because it was small when it started and Jews will inbreed mostly, they ended up developing better and better intellectual capacities. This myth has been, this hypothesis since then has been debunked. उसके अलग अलग वजूहात हैं. Ashkenazi Jews की जब आप सिर्फ genetic history, जिस तरह वो microsatellites का map मैंने आपको दिखाया, उसको देखेंगे तो आप पाएंगे कि Ashkenazi Jews have a very high percentage of European descent in them actually. So they are not the cornered population like the ones in the Hindu Kush that we were talking about. They actually have a lot of intermixing. कई सालों से, कई वक्तों पे Ashkenazi Jews ने mate किया और populations के साथ, और उसकी ख़ास तौर पे evidence हमें मिलती है mitochondrial DNA से. अच्छा, ये बड़ी interesting चीज़ है. In biology we think a lot about the female sex. Part of the reason for that is कि आपका mitochondria आपको सिर्फ अपनी अम्मी से मिलेगा. इसका ये मतलब है कि आपके अब्बा आपको genetic contribution तो दे रहे हैं, 50% of your DNA is from your mother, 50% from your father, but mitochondrial DNA आपको excess मिल रहा है अपनी अम्मी से. तो हम actually आपका mitochondrial DNA सिर्फ देख के आपकी अम्मी के साथ associations बना सकते हैं, and then we can follow the maternal lineage of an entire population to see कि the women in that population वो कौन सी genetic contribution कर रही हैं. Ashkenazi Jews had a high number of women actually within that population जो mate कर रही थी उनके साथ.
Jewish mother इसीलिए मशहूर है.
Jewish mother, interesting, okay. The other thing was कि my assumption was कि Jews में now it's the idea कि अगर आप एक Jewish माँ हो और आपका कोई और ethnicity के साथ हुआ है तो बच्चा Jew can important consequences on the genetics because that is how we're categorizing Ashkenazi. Historically they found that this was not the case. There was a lot of Y chromosome as well, and ये जो policy है of the mother being Jewish, that came a lot later, probably because it's easier to tell कि माँ का बच्चा कौन सा है, whereas to say कि like इस बाप का कौन सा बच्चा है is harder to determine. Okay, so एक तो ये बात कि Ashkenazi Jews are not the population we thought they were. Number 2, Ashkenazi Jews, अगर आप अच्छा Ashkenazi Jews को post World War I and then post World War II were subjected to a lot of rigorous IQ tests, and partly during their migration events into Europe, and we found कि at those times Ashkenazi Jews जो हैं उनका IQ इतना अच्छा नहीं था. They were doing much worse than the normal Caucasian populations at the time. तो अगर Ashkenazi Jews में कोई genetic contributions है intellect की वजह से, वो 1940s से 2023 तक के बीच में तो इस तरह इवॉल्व नहीं की जा सकती. दैट इज़ नॉट इनफ टाइम फॉर द जेनेटिक्स टू वर्क आउट. So this idea has been debunked mostly. Okay. There's the Klotho gene, which is the only gene हमें लगता है जो कि कुछ contribution है उसकी intellect के साथ, but not with IQ. Klotho is producing a protein that is associated with mental aging, और इसको एक as an anti-aging target भी consider किया जा रहा है. What they find is कि वो लोग जिनके पास KLVS variant है इस gene का, वो mentally उतनी तेज़ी से age नहीं करते. They have lower chances of Alzheimer's, but also उनकी जो cognitive facilities हैं वो बरकरार रहती हैं ज़्यादा वक्त तक. और अगर आप इस जीन का प्रोटीन एक माउस के अंदर डालेंगे तो उसकी कॉग्निटिव एबिलिटीज़ इम्प्रूव भी हो सकती हैं. आप सवाल करेंगे कि ये तो बड़ी फिट बात है, तो ये इसका कोई रेशियल ताल्लुक है क्लोथो जीन का, क्या सियाफ आम लोगों में ज़्यादा पाई जाती है? और एक्चुअली सियाफ आम लोगों में ज़्यादा पाई जाती है, बट द इफेक्ट इट हैज़ ऑन इंटेलिजेंस इज़ नॉट सो लार्ज कि इट कैन अकाउंट फॉर इंटेलेक्चुअल डिफरेंसेस इन लार्ज पॉपुलेशंस. इट्स स्टिल अ स्मॉल इफेक्ट. ओके. गाल्टन ने ट्विन स्टडीज़ काफ़ी ज़्यादा की थी. हम नाज़ी जर्मनी की बात कर रहे थे, एंड there was a guy called the White Angel in Auschwitz because he would take the twins in the camps and he would do interesting experiments on them. For example, वो दो twins को मार के उनको आपस में graft कर देता था to see if they would survive. Horrible experiments. And then you also had the Nuremberg trials, by the way, जिसमें ऐसे eugenicists के खिलाफ फिर proceedings आई थी. And eugenics as a philosophy took a big hit because of the Nuremberg trials. Bharat, twin studies. मैंने आपको बताया कि twins are very interesting because they are a way of ruling out environmental factors and genetic factors. रॉबर्ट प्लोमन ने 2013 में एक स्टडी की थी जिसमें उसने देखा कि अगर आप एक ट्विन हो ना, दो ट्विन्स, आइडेंटिकल ट्विन्स, तो आप अगर आपका एक ट्विन ए लेवल्स में अच्छा ग्रेड पा चुका है तो आपके भी चांसेस ज़्यादा हैं कि आप ए लेवल्स में अच्छा ग्रेड करेंगे. इसका मतलब ये है कि ए लेवल्स ग्रेड का कोई जेनेटिक कंट्रीब्यूशन है, क्योंकि इज़ द अजम्पशन दे वर मेकिंग बेस्ड ऑन दिस डेटा. क्योंकि अगर मेरे से आइडेंटिकल शख्स, जेनेटिकली आइडेंटिकल शख्स ए लेवल्स में अच्छा कर रहा है तो मेरे भी चांसेस ज़्यादा हैं कि मैं ए लेवल्स में अच्छा करूँगा. और ऑल्सो नॉन आइडेंटिकल ट्विन्स में ये फिनोमेना नहीं नज़र आता. नॉन आइडेंटिकल ट्विन्स में ए लेवल ग्रेड के साथ वो सेम एसोसिएशन नहीं है. इनिशियली जब ये रिसर्च पब्लिश हुई थी तो बड़ी कंट्रोवर्शियल थी और लोगों ने कहा कि दिस इज़ क्लियर एविडेंस के जेनेटिक्स का एक इंटेलिजेंस के साथ ताल्लुक है. सिंस देन इसके स्टडी पे बहुत ज़्यादा तनकीद हुई है, क्योंकि थिंक अबाउट इट, यू नो, आई एम मोइज, आई हैव अ ट्विन हु लुक्स एग्जैक्टली लाइक मी. प्लोमिन साहब कह रहे हैं कि ट्विन्स में हम जेनेटिक्स आइडेंटिकल है, but he is forgetting about environment. He is forgetting that if I have a twin who looks exactly like me, based on the appearance alone, it is likely that people will treat him similarly. Even if हमें अलहदा कर दिया जाए at birth, appearance will have a consequence. And also, the environment I shared with my twin while I was in my mom's womb will also have an influence on my intellectual capacity. अब वो genetic नहीं है, वो मेरी माँ का असर है. For example, folic acid. On my intellectual capacity, which was shared by my twin. And so actually प्लोमिन की रिसर्च पे काफ़ी ज़्यादा तनकीद हुई और उसके बाद लेटेस्ट स्टडी शोड कि जेनेटिकली आइडेंटिकल ट्विन्स जब उनको डिफरेंट सोशल क्लासेस या डिफरेंट इन्वायरमेंट्स में रेस किया जाए तो उनकी IQ की जो एसोसिएशन है वो उतनी हद तक बरकरार नहीं रहती जितनी प्लोमिन साहब क्लेम कर रहे थे. These are two different studies. This is IQ and this is GCSE score. Yeah.
आई थिंक ये जो एपीजेनेटिक्स है इसमें फिर उसका ज़्यादा रोल हो जाएगा जेनेटिक्स के बजाय.
या
एपीजेनेटिक्स का.
सो एपीजेनेटिक्स इज़ द आइडिया कि ओके, सो आई वोंट से आइडिया. देयर वाज अ रिसर्च दैट फाउंड कि पीपल दैट हैड अंडरगॉन द बंगाल फेमिन, उनकी जो पुश्तें थीं, अच्छा बंगाल फेमिन कॉज ड्यूरिंग द ब्रिटिश कॉलोनियल रूल ड्यू टू द वे कि जिस तरह उन्होंने फंड्स अप्रोप्रिएट किए थे बंगाल में. दे फाउंड कि वो लोग जिनकी आबाव अजदाद ने बंगाल फेमिन सहा था उनमें हायर रेट्स थी ऑफ ओबेसिटी, विच इज़ इंटरेस्टिंग, क्योंकि genetically I'm getting the same genes from my parents, but how is it कि उनका जो environment उस वक्त था, जो उनकी खुराक उस वक्त थी, वो मेरी आज की body को influence कर रही है. And this isn't my mother, this is like my grandmother's grandmother, for example. And the way people dealt with this was to call it epigenetics, कि DNA के अलावा एक environmental असर है आपके genetics के ऊपर, which we are currently not accounting for, and that's epigenetics. So yes, your point, there are epigenetic effects on intelligence, probably, but hard to measure, just because intelligence is hard to measure. And I've left epigenetics out of the talk for now because I didn't want to complicate it.
Lamarck isn't by another name.
Yeah. Lamarck was this guy who suggested that the environment is influencing the attributes of organisms, और ये attributes जो हैं वो change हो सकते हैं.
Epigenetics, is it like an accepted idea? Is it like standard science? And if so, how is that influence carried in the DNA or through some other process?
Yeah, great question. So, epigenetics is accepted for certain phenomena and not for others. For phenomena for which it is accepted is things like smoking, alcohol abuse. क्योंकि उसमें I can clearly see कि if you are a mother who was smoking और आप and then you later underwent pregnancy, I can see कि आपके जो बच्चे हैं उनके DNA में methylations हुई हुई हैं, chemical changes हुए हुए हैं, which are what we consider epigenetic marks, which influence the way that DNA is read and the genes it's expressing. And this is also coming out of twin studies, by the way. But in the sense that like there's a mother who is a twin who is not smoking, and then there's a mother who is a twin who is smoking.
So in a simple way, it's like it causes genetic mutation. The environmental effect is causing the genetic mutation, which is being carried forward into heredity.
Yeah. We don't call it mutation because mutation हम consider करते हैं nucleotide changes. Yeah, this is a chemical addition on top of the DNA. और कभी कभार उस DNA पे भी नहीं होती वो DNA. अच्छा, DNA बड़ी interesting चीज़ है. अगर मैं आपके सारे cells के अंदर से आपकी body के सारे cells में से DNA निकाल दूँ और उसको completely linear कर दूँ, एक मॉलिक्यूल थिक धागा जो आप देख नहीं सकेंगे क्योंकि इट्स वन मॉलिक्यूल थिक, उसको मैं सीधा कर दूँ किसी डोरी की तरह, तो इट कैन गो एज फार एज द मून एंड बैक फ्रॉम द अर्थ. सो दिस मैसिव अमाउंट ऑफ DNA is coiled around proteins, microscopic proteins, and really the question for the cell is कि कौन सा DNA मैंने ज़्यादा खोलना है उस प्रोटीन से और पढ़ना है उसको, और कौन सा DNA मैंने थोड़ा फोल्ड कर देना है, उसकी ज़रूरत मुझे भी नहीं है. तो एपिजेनेटिक्स इज़ इन्फ्लुएंसिंग दैट फिनोमेना. बट तो वहाँ पे स्मोकिंग, अल्कोहल अब्यूज़, वहाँ पे एपिजेनेटिक्स इज़ वेल नोन. प्लेसेस जहाँ पे अभी भी कंट्रोवर्शियल है इज़ साइकोलॉजिकल ट्रॉमा. वी टॉक अबाउट ट्रांसजेनरेशनल ट्रॉमा कि अगर मेरे ऊपर कोई जुल्म हुआ है तो फिर क्या मेरे बच्चे जो हैं, इफ़ आई एम एसोसिएटेड विद डिप्रेशन, विल माई चिल्ड्रन हैव कॉन्सिक्वेंसेज. उस पर देयर इज स्टिल डिबेट, बट देयर इज गुड रिसर्च. या हाँ, गुड क्वेश्चन. डू यू वांट टू रिपीट द क्वेश्चन इन द माइक? हाँ, तो माइक्रोब्स इन्वायरमेंट में कंसिडर किए जाएंगे कि नहीं? व्हाट आई नो इज़ कि children that have C-section are born through C-section. They don't have the same microbiome than a child that would be born naturally, and that has consequences on the child's health. Intelligence पे उसका क्या असर है मुझे नहीं पता, मगर अब we are learning about the gut and brain axis. What we are learning is कि the microbes in your gut can interact with your nervous system and affect its ability to produce serotonin, for example. And there's been fecal transplants, you know, आप microbic organism से लेके transplant कर दें दूसरे में in mice, and it changes their depressive outcomes. So yeah, but intelligence, I don't know. Okay, so twin studies. I'll talk about morality and criminality very quickly क्योंकि I know कि 4:30 हो चुके हैं काफ़ी. तो there's a gene, it's called MAOA. उसका एक वेरिएंट है 3R के नाम से. 3R जो है वो एक प्रोटीन प्रोड्यूस करता है जो आपके दिमाग में सेरोटोनिन को अफेक्ट करता है. इनिशियल रिसर्च हुई थी जिसमें उन्होंने पाया कि जिन लोगों के पास ये 3R वेरिएंट है उनकी नंबर ऑफ इनकार्सरेशंस, यानी कि वो जेल में कितनी दफ़ा जा रहे हैं वो ज़्यादा है, उनका क्रिमिनल रिकॉर्ड ज़्यादा होता है, एंड दे आर displaying some level of antisocial behavior potentially. सवाल फौरी तौर पे ये बना कि ये जो जीन है ये अफ्रीकन अमेरिकन में ज़्यादा पाई जाती है या कम पाई जाती है. तो initially it was found at a higher rate amongst African Americans compared to Caucasians. When we did further research on this, we found that only those African Americans which had this allele, this gene, but then also were subjected to abuse as children, were more likely to have a criminal record, were more likely to display these behaviors of criminality essentially. तो turns out कि हमने पहले जब इस जीन को पढ़ा तो हमें लगा कि genetics का एक association है with morality, if you want to call it that. और जब हमने इसके अंदर delve deeper किया तो हमें पता लगा कि actually it is a combination of genetics and environment. And if you are, for example, someone जिसके पास ये जीन है मगर you have not been abused या you do not have a past history of trauma, your probability of being a criminal is equal to any other person. So this was an interesting example of an initial scientific fact which was suggesting that morality ka consequence hai, and then another fact suggesting that no, that's more complicated and it's also environmental.
An interesting thought comes to my mind that should they given as while listening to your comment, an interesting thought comes to my mind that should benefit be given to those people who have a history of defected genes while it comes to criminality and morality, while in judging what they have gone through, like in the judicial systems.
यानी कि अगर मैं एक जज हूँ और मुझे कोई बता रहे क्रिमिनलिटी वाली जीन है तो क्या मैं आपकी अपनी जजमेंट चेंज कर सकता हूँ?
नहीं चेंज नहीं, मतलब कि उसका बात ये हो रही है कि दो बंदे हैं एक सिचुएशन में और एक बंदा वो जीन कैरी कर रहा है जिसके पास्ट एंसेस्टर से हिस्ट्री मिली है उसे. ही इज़ मोर लाइकली टू कमिट अ क्राइम देन द अदर हु इज़ नॉट हैविंग इट. So what's got to do with judging him? That's another debate.
हाँ, अगर उसे ancestral trauma मिला है, for example, let's talk about, क्योंकि this gene is associated with, if it's associated with environment, and and then as a judge, shall I give you a more lenient sentence based on that alone? I don't know, man. I think that's a social question more than a scientific one. What the science is telling us is that morality, intellect, ये सब चीज़ें are more complex than genes alone. It is a combination of environment, and often even when we can account for environment, we can't figure out the factors that are increasing or reducing.
Suppose we see that his deviant and erratic behavior comes from his ancestors as well, somewhat.
This gene, by the way, later जो ये variant था, the fact that it was higher in African Americans, if you look at all of the a larger subset of just African populations, that doesn't hold to be true anymore. Yeah, I don't know. It's a combination. It's you have to have that gene, and then you have to also be have the environment. And then even then, it only increases your probability of committing crime. By the way, they found that the Caucasians that had this gene, they had a higher probability of committing this crime as well. But unme the environmental stimulus wasn't as important.
See, in the current political scenario of Pakistan, you see a certain locality, use ethnicity, province, who has gone through violence, terrorism. They are right now making a decision that is somewhat different from the other provinces, the other ethnicities maybe. So maybe it has got to do something with the eugenics. I would like Sir Pervez to have a comment on it.
ये जो फौजी और सियासतदान हैं इनके जीन्स में कोई खराबी है क्या? वो तो ये किए जा रहे हैं. I don't think that's genetically related at all.
Okay.
Actually, we have very low levels of social morality in Pakistan, and the reason for that we must investigate, but I don't think is genetic.
So I've talked for more than an hour about genetics, eugenics, race. And what I hope I've given you is a picture that is complicated but still somewhat based on a clear path, which is at least my interpretation of the data. And this isn't just mine. So Adam Rutherford, who is a professor at UCL, he's the chair of genetics in society. So his job is literally to look at how genetics is related with society. And other scientists, most of the scientific community have a consensus that race is primarily social. However, there is enough resolution on the DNA कि हम populations or geographical populations of humans identify कर सकते हैं. दो contradictory बातें लगती हैं मगर है नहीं हैं. When you argue with a racist next time, if you want to, you can bring these up. I want to talk briefly about what this means for the future. This is He Jiankhu. He was the first person जिसने genetically engineered इंसान पैदा करवाए. उससे मेरा मुराद ये है कि he had a clinical trial जिसमें कि वो लोग जिनको HIV के chances ज़्यादा थे या उनका एक couple जो है उसको HIV था, they were worried about HIV being transmitted to their next children, वो IVF करवा रहे थे. IVF is in vitro fertilization, test tube babies जिसको आमतौर पे कहा जाता है. और ही जियांकू सजेस्टेड कि ये टेस्ट ट्यूब बेबीज़ जो हैं क्यों ना इनकी जीन्स को ऐसे इंजीनियर किया जाए, ख़ासतौर पे जो CCR5 जीन है कि उनको HIV ना हो सके. He did that and he generated these babies. So this is the first instance of genetically engineered humans on the planet, happened in 2018. He Jiankhu tried to publish his results in Nature, which is a fancy journal, but was rejected. This story was broken out by MIT Technology Review. मैं इसकी बात इसलिए कर रहा हूँ क्योंकि he was later jailed, he was sentenced, he was fined by the Chinese government. He's back doing research now. मगर there was a big cry from the scientific community कि यार ये क्या कर रहे हो तुम, you know, because the West at least for a very long time had been discussing regulations associated with human genetic engineering, and this guy just did it in a clinic in China without a lot of governmental oversight. Later they found out that the documents he generated to do these clinical trials were fraudulent थे, which is why he went to jail. The point I'm trying to make, अच्छा उसके साथ साथ recently FDA ने सबसे पहली जीन थेरेपीज़ भी अप्रूव करना शुरू कर दी हैं. ही साहब की जो रिसर्च है जो उन्होंने बच्चे पैदा करवाए वो अपनी अगली पुश्तों में भी वो जीन्स डाल सकते हैं जो म्यूटेट की थी उन्होंने. ये जो जीन थेरेपी है दैट्स नॉट हाउ दिस वर्क्स. जीन थेरेपी सिर्फ एक ख़ास पेशेंट को अफेक्ट करेगी, उसके जो जर्म लाइन सेल्स हैं जो अगली नस्ल बनाएंगे उनको नहीं अफेक्ट करेगी. पॉइंट आई एम ट्राइंग टू मेक इज़ के फॉर द फर्स्ट टाइम इन ह्यूमैनिटी we have the ability to engineer our own genes. We have had a history of eugenics and racist ideology जिसको साइंस के गाइज में पेश करके एक प्रोपेगेंडा मशीन बनाया गया. What I leave you with is the question के do you think we are ready to regulate these technologies? Do you think we are ready to use them? And what sort of future do you perceive for yourself and for your communities?
कैंसर जीन्स को भी इस पे, और ये मैंने डॉक्यूमेंट्री भी कैंसर रिलेटेड ही देखी जिसमें वो कॉन्स्पिरेसी पे बात करते थे कि कैंसर का क्योर किया जा सकता है, बट ये जो फार्मा इंडस्ट्री है इसका चूँकि स्टेक इन्वॉल्व है.
अच्छा, ये ही जियांकू का स्टेटमेंट था
तो नहीं, उसमें ये था कि इन्होंने फिर ये बताया था कि हम कैंसर को क्योर कर सकते हैं, और उन्होंने एग्जांपल नहीं की थी कि इन्होंने HIV जो था वो उस तरह से उन्होंने म्यूटेट कर दिया था.
बट ये क्योर नहीं हुआ. आई वांट टू पॉइंट आउट कि
इसका फिर क्या है, मतलब इसको अगर मेडिकली इसको थोड़ा सा रेगुलेट कर दिया जाए तो ये तो बहुत बड़ा एक फिनोमेना होगा कि आप बीमारियों से जो है वो छुटकारा हासिल करते चले जाएंगे. तो ये क्या, थोड़ा सा अगर इस पर आप थोड़ा सा पॉइंट कर सकें कि इसको कैसे हम रेगुलेट कैसे कर सकते हैं.
हाँ, गुड पॉइंट. एक तो ये बात कि ही ट्राइड पब्लिशिंग हिज रिजल्ट्स मगर दे नेवर सॉ द लाइट ऑफ डे. देयर वर रिव्यूअर्स जिन्होंने उसका काम रिव्यू किया था, एंड बेस्ड ऑन देयर कमेंट्स इट सीम्स के वी आरंट इवन सर्टेन कि ये म्यूटेशन करके उन बच्चियों को HIV ना होने के चांसेस कम हुए भी हैं कि नहीं, सॉरी HIV होने के चांसेस कम हुए भी हैं कि नहीं है, बिकॉज यू वुड हैव टू डू द एक्सपेरिमेंट, ट्राई टू इन्फेक्ट देम विद HIV, एंड दैट वुड रिक्वायर ए लार्ज स्केल क्लिनिकल ट्रायल. तो एटलीस्ट यहाँ इस हद तक वी डोंट नो इज़ व्हाट आई एम ट्राइंग टू से, बट वी नो थियोरेटिकली इट्स पॉसिबल, विच इज़ ऑल दैट मैटर्स रियली. Question is, should we do this? Should we genetically engineer humans in the sense कि उनकी आगे जो नस्लें हैं वो भी वो genetic mutations जो मैं पैदा कर रहा हूँ वो inherit करें. Should we engineer ourselves as a race? And how should it be regulated? मेरा क्या opinion है इसके ऊपर? I think probably not the right time. Or if you're going to do it, give me harder science, which is more reliable, and have more conversations about it than we are having right now. If another scientist were to pop up who would have done something similar to He Jiankhu, I would be worried. Because what it seems like to me is that if more people are popping up in this way, so it's unregulated, it's very individual, rather than a community of scientists saying, okay, this is the way we're going to move forward. So, एक तो ये, दूसरा ये, I don't know, I think like, I like the quote कि, I think someone said that humanity has medieval institutions, but godlike technology. And, you know, and you see that with AI especially. I am quite excited about AI. I'm not an AI pessimist, but I think with genetics, something as irreversible, especially if it's germline mutations, so you would need to have more conversations. And the current international regime doesn't allow for that. Yani, what I mean by that is that हमारे पास Convention on Biological Diversity है, Chemical Weapons Convention है, इनकी Conference of Parties होती रहती हैं हर साल, COP28 जैसे हुआ था, COP28? हाँ, the 28th Conference of Parties. And the conversations so far seem to be about maintaining biodiversity, not so much about regulating new incoming genetic technologies. और जब होती भी हैं तो उनमें बड़ा politics involved होता है. मसलन my field of gene drives, उस पे ban लगने लगा था in 2019 at one of these conference of parties because of a lot of push by non-governmental organizations के gene drives जो हैं वो एक extinction technology है, उससे हम वापस नहीं जा सकेंगे. It's all rhetoric. So yeah. Yes. Okay.
Is it possible to collect genes from around the world and combine them to make one race? And will that be advantageous or disadvantageous?
Collect genes from around the world and turn them into one race. अच्छा ये ना एक तो इस पे historical perspective ये है कि Darwin was also suggesting कि शायद आगे जैसे ह्यूमैनिटी बढ़ेगी तो देयर विल बी मोर क्रॉसिंग बिटवीन रेसेस और उसने ये भी सजेस्ट किया था कि जो कम नस्ल वाले लोग हैं उसके मुताबिक वो उनकी जो एट्रीब्यूट्स हैं वो डाइल्यूट हो जाएंगी बाय द मोर सिविलाइज्ड रेसेस. आई डोंट नो अगर आप ह्यूमंस का डेमोग्राफिक देखें कि ये जेनेटिक मिक्सिंग ज़्यादा हो रही है कि कम हो रही है, मगर व्हाट यू विल फाइंड इस कि अगर रैंडम मेटिंग हो रही है ना एक लार्ज पॉपुलेशन ऑफ एनिमल्स के बीच में तो फिर एक होमोजेनस यानी कि एक बराबर किस्म की आपको शायद रेस नज़र आ जाए उनमें, मगर ह्यूमंस डोंट मेट रैंडमली. एंड अगर आप इसको आर्टिफिशियली करना चाहें कि मैं इंसानों से कहूँ कि आवर एम टुडे इन टर्म्स ऑफ रिप्रोडक्शन इज़ टू हैव अ सिंगल रेस, probably I don't know what the genetic consequences of that are going to be. I don't even know if that's possible क्योंकि genetics and race, what it seems like from the research is कि it's not we हम सन 2000 में हमें लगा कि हम इंसानों का DNA सीक्वेंस कर लेंगे और बस हम अन्नी पा देंगे. we will have perfect medicine, personalized medicine. हर बीमारी का एक genetic relationship हम निकाल लेंगे हर trait का. We did that and we have no idea. We have some good ideas, but we find that traits are more complicated than a single gene. Human variability is more complicated than single genes and our sort of restricted ways of thinking. So I don't have a good answer to your question. All I can say is I don't know, and most people don't know.
Thank you. वैसे अगर हम कामयाब हो गए तो हम इसको नस्ली तो ही
नस्ली तो
Nice. Great lecture, बहुत अच्छा लगा. Julian Huxley जो biologist था, I think after सेकेंड वर्ल्ड वॉर, उसने ट्रांसह्यूमनिज्म का एक आइडिया दिया था। मुझे तो लगता है वो भी कोई यूजेनिक्स 2 पॉइंट समथिंग था, तो उस हवाले से कोई कुछ डिस्कशन हम कर सकें।
मेरे अंदर ना दो लोग हैं जो लड़ाई करते हैं इस पर्सपेक्टिव के ऊपर। आई एम एन आर्डेंट बिलीवर इन डेमोक्रेटाइजेशन ऑफ टेक्नोलॉजी, यानी मुझे लगता है कि सिंथेटिक बायोलॉजी बड़ी कूल टेक्नोलॉजी है और हमें उसके बारे में ज़्यादा बात करनी चाहिए और लोगों को फैसिलिटेट करना चाहिए कि वो ना सिर्फ उसके बारे में सीख सकें बट घर पे बैठे बैठे एक्सपेरिमेंट्स कर सकें। और ऐसा हो रहा है। तो एक देयर इज़ अ लार्ज फील्ड ऑफ DIY बायोलॉजिस्ट्स जो कि घर पे बैठे बैठे उनके पास कार्डबोर्ड से बने हुए कुछ इक्विपमेंट है। हम सेंट्रीफ्यूज जिस तरह इस्तेमाल करते हैं ना खून को स्पिन करने के लिए ताकि उसकी लेवल्स सेपरेट हो जाएं, आप एक टॉय आता है जो कार्डबोर्ड से उसका आप खींचते हैं एंड स्पिन्स रियली फास्ट, यू कैन मेक इट योरसेल्फ, रबर बैंड्स, दे यूज़ दैट एंड यू नो इट डज द जॉब फॉर मोलेकुलर बायोलॉजी जो उन्होंने करनी है। बैक्टीरिया वो अपनी आर्म पिट के अंदर एक ट्यूब में रख के ग्रो कर रहे हैं क्योंकि दैट्स अ गुड टेम्परेचर फॉर बैक्टीरिया टू ग्रो एट। It's getting very easy to genetically engineer bacteria, but also to genetically engineer yourself. तो CRISPR-Cas9 जो टेक्नोलॉजी इस्तेमाल की ही जियांकू ने, आप उसे कमर्शियली भी ख़रीद सकते हैं। पाकिस्तान की रेगुलेशन का मुझे नहीं पता क्योंकि यहाँ पे वो कस्टम्स वाले रोक लें शायद, मगर अमेरिका में you can buy this and actually some very popular synthetic biologists are selling these kits to the public. And there was this guy who tried injecting himself with the CRISPR-Cas9 cocktail जो उसकी lactose intolerance को ख़त्म कर देगी। So far those experiments seem like publicity stunts rather than actual hard science क्योंकि you know उसमें it's hard to do science, it's hard to create medicine because you don't know what concentration of Cas9 you need, you don't know whether that mutation will have the right effects. But I see a growing interest of the world, or at least a growing interest of DIY biologists in this field, और वो independently ये काम कर रहे हैं। पहले FBI ने इसके बारे में काफ़ी सोचा क्योंकि these DIY biologists also tend to have conferences, and I was reading कि the way the government is regulating them now is kind of just let them be, but with oversight. क्योंकि होता क्या कि ये communities of biology ये जब अलग अलग आपस में कम्युनिकेट करती हैं, ये खुद ही कुछ नॉर्म्स अपने ऊपर इस्टेब्लिश कर लेती हैं जो कि उन्हें खुद ही रेगुलेट कर रहे हैं विद इन देयर ओन कॉन्टेक्स्ट। तो योर पॉइंट वाज कि ट्रांसह्यूमनिज्म आगे कैसे बढ़ेगी। इट मेक्स मी हैप्पी दैट पीपल आर डूइंग दीज थिंग्स मोस्टली। सम पीपल आर शो ऑफ्स एंड दे डू पब्लिसिटी स्टंट्स, बट आई एंजॉय द फैक्ट पीपल आर डूइंग बायोलॉजी। द क्वेश्चन इज के विल ह्यूमन्स इन द फ्यूचर have the ability कि मैं घर पे बैठे बैठे कम से कम अपने जर्म लाइन सेल्स नहीं मगर अपने पास जो ख़मीर है मेरी रोटी के अंदर या जो बैक्टीरिया मेरे आसपास है उनको इंजीनियर कर सकूं। क्या मैं अपनी बॉडी को इंजीनियर कर सकता हूँ जेनेटिकली? आई थिंक इट्स गोइंग टू बी लाइकली, मगर उसका स्ट्रक्चर क्या होगा उन टेक्नोलॉजीज़ का, हु विल कंट्रोल दैम, आई डोंट नो। न्यूरलिंक इज़ अ गुड एग्जांपल because I'm talking too much, but it's a good example because it's a private entity that is developing this technology to have a brain-computer interface. Now, if that technology becomes worldwide available, but it's monopolized by one company, so that will have consequences on humanity. तो मुझे तो लगता है कि transhumanism dystopia भी हो सकता है, utopia भी हो सकता है, depending on our norms and how we think about these technologies.
I had no idea that this is being sold publicly, so people can like do it at their homes.
Yeah.
They can create like genetically modified bacteria and germs. Don't you think that's like extremely dangerous? They can create some like super strains of harmful bacteria, viruses.
Yeah. There were worries about this initially. So the company that is selling this, उनका नाम मैं भूल गया हूँ. I think there's a Nordic god जिसके पीछे उन्होंने नाम रखा है. George Church is the guy who is selling this, and he's collaborating with this other synthetic biologist जिसने NASA के लिए काम किया, फिर उसे छोड़ दिया. There's a good documentary on this on Netflix. I think it's called Biohackers, maybe शायद something like that. So yes, people are selling this commercially in the United States. I don't know how the state regulation works out, but you can access it. And people have done Facebook lives जहाँ पे वो अपने आप को inject कर रहे हैं with this stuff. And there are also DIY biologists that are putting like magnets inside of their bodies and just playing around with their bodies. And
so they modify some cells and they inject themselves.
There's
no regulation.
No, there's no regulation.
Like there is regulation to buy poison. You can kill yourself with this as well.
Huh, sure. So far there hasn't been a death, but yeah, I don't know if
this is absolutely shocking.
Yeah. I don't know if regulation's been updated. The last Facebook Live I saw was 2020.
But I'm more interested. Don't you? You were saying you support this kind of usage of this. Don't you see the danger in it, and like how do you rationalize it?
My perspective, at least engineering gene drives, has been.
Is it less dangerous than heroin?
I'm not sure, sir. It can be more dangerous, probably.
I mean, heroin's also regulated, right? Like, if not regulated, it's banned. So, शायद ये मेरा ना bias है, but I have spent 4 years trying to genetically engineer mosquitoes so they can stop spreading malaria. And what I've learned is that it's so hard to make something that works. Making something that's dangerous is just on the next level. And this is really interesting. If you type into ChatGPT, give me the instructions I need to create a gene drive जो कि किसी मुल्क की economy तबाह कर दे, because agricultural organisms को influence कर रहे हैं आप. So ChatGPT will give you the right instruction. And I was surprised by the fact that they were very accurate. It goes all the way from DNA code to what you have to do in the lab to make this. But experientially what I found is that making something that works is hard in biology, especially without the infrastructure, which is millions of dollars, really, that is invested in it. So, मेरा इस वक्त opinion वाकई में ये है कि जो कर रहे हैं उन्हें करने दें. I think the best outcome that I see coming out of it is more interest in science and biology. And I think what we'll find is, maybe I'm too optimistic, but I think what we'll find is that because people will take more interest in DIY biology, it will initiate conversations like the one you and I are having about how to regulate these technologies, and the world will self-regulate. Maybe I'm too optimistic actually, because nuclear bombs. Yeah, but also I guess it's a choice at the end of the day.
Sir, thank you for a very interesting lecture. 3 short questions. Are we there yet to create a Jurassic Park? That's one. And
no, but there's some very good fiction written on the future of synthetic biology. Recently I read a sort of hard science fiction on this idea कि वो सब जानवर जो कि zoonotic diseases spread करते हैं, जैसे COVID was a zoonotic disease, वो उनको हमने cage कर दिया है, and अब वो सिर्फ as a visual treat रह गए हैं आपके पास. Humanity has divided itself. So I enjoy reading fiction because it makes us think like what sort of future do we want with this technology. We are not ready to make Jurassic Park because we don't understand the developmental biology of how you can make an organism develop in a certain way कि वो बिल्कुल मुख्तलिफ खदोखाल बन जाए उसके. Organism तो क्या हम organs नहीं generate कर सकते, we cannot generate artificial limbs just yet. Jurassic Park is probably fiction.
Okay, so humans have had the same bodies for millennia now, right? 2 hands, 2 eyes, etc. And we have been researching on this for as long. And there are, high stakes, high returns. A lot of advancement has been made in the nanotechnology. We are going to close to atomic levels, gone to outer space, mapping exoplanets. So why it is taking so long to crack the human body?
To crack the human body? We have 3 billion base pairs of DNA, so each DNA molecule has 1 nucleotide inside of it. उस एक nucleotide को आप chemically उसके बारे में सोच सकते हैं, या आप उसके बारे में information के तौर पे सोच सकते हैं. तो 1 nucleotide can be treated as 1 bit, let's say. 3 billion base pairs of DNA in every cell in our body. That is a lot of information. And then on top of that is epigenetics, which is the idea like how is this information read? Because the cells in my skin are the same as the cells in my bones or in my heart in terms of the DNA they have, but they are completely different in their structures and their morphologies, in their behavior. DNA same है, पड़ा मुख्तलिफ तरीक़ों से जा रहा है, तो उसके ऊपर added complexity आ गई. और the task for biology today is to really understand how DNA is read and how it translates into physical features all the way from cells interactions with tissues to humans and large bodies. ये बहुत मुश्किल काम है, you know, like we just don't have sometimes you just don't have the computational power to deal with that information, but other times we don't have the experimental setup जो कि identify कर सके वो सारे proteins जो एक DNA sequence के ऊपर बैठ रहे हैं उसको मुख्तलिफ तरीके से read करवा रहे हैं उसके ऊपर. Yeah, it's hard is my short answer. We'll probably get better at it as we progress. As DNA sequencing gets cheaper, I think we might. And also there's robotics which is coming into biology. So जैसे मैंने आपसे बात की कि there's a lot of information. The way you deal with a lot of information is also you do a lot of experiments in parallel at the same time, changing one factor at a time. इंसानों के बस की बात नहीं है, but robots that are streamlined for these sort of experiments, वो एक ऐसे बड़े पैमाने पे बायोलॉजी कर सकते हैं, बायोलॉजी रिसर्च कर सकते हैं और इतनी ज़्यादा इन्फॉर्मेशन पैदा कर सकते हैं कि then maybe we have a shot at understanding important diseases in the human body. Yeah.
Sorry, you had a very long lecture. Just on the lighter side, some celebs in US and some people around the world get their genetic survey done. Just briefly, if एक family कुछ लोग अपना test कराते हैं, I've heard that you can go 15 generations back and you can actually know. And can you actually know? I mean, it's an authentic. There is some laws that prove that this is your origin. And those people 15 generations back, do they still exist? Can you actually relate to them?
Yeah, good question. So,
just briefly, you can have a lecture on that.
No, I enjoy it. तो आप लोग जब तक बैठे हैं मैं तो नहीं छोड़ूंगा आपको, मगर I can be brief. Yes is the short answer. And the best example of that was the Golden State Killer in California. So this was a guy who I think 20 years ago had killed a lot of women in the sort of Golden State, Cali area. And the police weren't able to figure out कि ये कौन था, but they had genetic evidence. 20 years after the deaths had occurred, उस बंदे के cousin ने अपना DNA sequence करवाया 23andMe के साथ. It was either 23andMe, which is a company, or ancestry.com, which is a different company. But the way these companies interacted with the FBI was that there was an open data sharing policy, which a lot of the people that are using these companies don't know. कि अगर मैं customer हूँ आपका, मेरा genetic data जो है वो share भी किया जा सकता है. तो खैर इस बंदे के cousin ने अपना genetic data share किया, and the police, by matching the cousin's genetic sequence with that at the crime scene, and then also looking at the ancestry of that particular killer जो उनका एक candidate था, were able to catch him 20 years later. So it's a very powerful technique, and it can absolutely.
15 generations back.
15 is probably
1500 years back.
Huh.
Some of these, I thought some of the Hollywood setups had done that. And it's possible in Pakistan. Pakistan had a genetic survey of Pakistan. And I didn't read this properly, but it has some connections with the Middle East. But maybe there is some certain issues like political stability in Pakistan is required before, the way Dr. Saab was saying, that we end up proving some people right or left. So that can cause us a bit of a problem.
Yeah.
That they are not actually from where they are trying to be. But in some other countries, has that been done? That the 15 generations back, you can check where are you actually coming from?
So the people you're talking about, I was thinking about this for a while. And I was thinking how many generations are there between people living today and the people in Saudi Arabia at the time. And I think probably theoretically, मुझे जहाँ तक पता है genetics का, it's doable. You can, if you have the genetic sequence of the progenitor and then of the people living today who are claiming relationship with that progenitor, तो आप कंपैरिजन करके उसको कंफर्म या डिनाई कर सकते हैं. उसमें कैवियाट ये आता है कि इफ़ यू आर टॉकिंग लॉन्गर genetic distances, more than 15 generations, तो our DNA undergoes recombination जहाँ में it sort of swaps chunks of DNA with each other, and there are अनगिनत ancestors हैं हमारी हिस्ट्री में जिनका DNA evidence हमारे जीनों में रहा ही नहीं है because of that recombination, and then DNA has mutated, genes have jumped inside of that site जो मुझे ancestor ने दी थी. Yeah, तो there are so many ancestors which I don't even know I have ancestral links with, even if I know my DNA, because that DNA has mutated too much. But 15 generations should be doable. Yeah.
Genghis Khan or Ayub Khan का ताल्लुक बताएं. You know, there is a Pakistani scientist who established that.
I forget his name. शायद आप में से किसी को याद हो. He used to work at the A.Q. Khan Hospital. Quite celebrated. Stanford में भी होते थे. मैं नाम भूल रहा हूँ उनका. But he established this link between Genghis Khan, Ayub Khan, and through the progeny that spread Genghis Khan onwards. So, are you familiar with that work?
I'm not familiar with Ayub Khan specifically, but 1 in 200 people in the world will have Mongolian DNA. We think from the same Mongolian male, and we think it might be Genghis Khan or his descendants. And we know this by tracing the Y chromosome, क्योंकि वो मेल से आता है. मगर ये ना बड़ी इंटरेस्टिंग बात है, क्योंकि लोग कहते हैं कि मैं पठान हूँ तो फिर मैं यूनान में जब सिकंदर आज़म आया था तो फिर मैं उसका वो मेरा एंसेस्टर हुआ. एंड इट्स हार्ड टू एक्सप्लेन टू देम. इट्स अ वेरी नुआंस्ड पॉइंट कि everyone is somehow related to Alexander, because if you just go far back enough in time, you and your ancestor and Alexander share the same common origin, they share the same common ancestor. And it's called, this phenomena is called the isogenetic point, because हो क्या रहा है कि अगर मैं अपने से 2 नस्लें पीछे देखूं तो फिर मेरे दादा हैं और फिर मेरी दादी हैं, बट अगर मैं उससे तो फिर परदादा, फिर परदादा के परदादा के परदादा. So you go far back enough in time, if you do the math, what you'll find is कि all of the people living today, अगर वो सब independent परदादा परदादियाँ करते तो फिर that is too many people to exist on the globe. So they would have to have shared some दादे परदादे at the same time. Historical?
People जो एक concept है, Abrahamic religions का जो concept है.
हाँ, तो they talk about mitochondrial Eve a lot, मगर it's not a single individual. It's important to clarify, because Abrahamic religions made it is specifically a single individual. We think it was groups of Homo sapiens that migrated out of Africa at individual times, or even Homo erectus or earlier populations. मगर अगर आपने अगर आप कह रहे हैं कि इंग्लैंड में इस वक्त जो लोग रहते हैं वो उनका सिंगल कॉमन एंसेस्टर कौन है, तो इफ़ आई गो फार बैक इनफ इन टाइम, तो 10th सेंचुरी में इंग्लैंड में जो शख्स जिंदा था, जितने भी लोग इंग्लैंड में जिंदा थे इन द 10th सेंचुरी वर ऑल कॉमन एंसेस्टर्स ऑफ ऑल पीपल लिविंग इन इंग्लैंड टुडे. एंड सो व्हाट दैट मीन्स इज़ के ऑल पीपल इन इंग्लैंड, जो कि बारिंग माइग्रेशन साउथ एशियंस वगैरह जो अंदर आए, मगर बारिंग माइग्रेशन ऑल पीपल इन इंग्लैंड टुडे who call themselves British, and you can do genetic analysis to test this, they share some DNA with the royal family, right? And so similarly, जैसे कि हसन निसार साहब कह रहे थे, let's get back to him, कि वो साउथ एशियन नहीं है. आप हैं साउथ एशियन क्योंकि बेशक आपकी इमीडिएट जेनेटिक लिंक्स ना भी हों, आप साउथ और सेंट्रल एशिया से हैं. At some point in history, you shared a common ancestor with a South Asian, and it's actually not as far back as you think. 10th century, for example, is not large in terms of evolutionary scales. But yeah.